বিশ্ববিদ্যাতীর্থ প্রাঙ্গণ কর মহোজ্জ্বল আজ হে বড় পুত্র সংঘ বিরাজ হে শুভ শঙ্খ বাজো বাজো হে বিশ্ববিদ্যাতীর্থ প্রাঙ্গণ কর মহোজ্জ্বল আজ হে বড় পুত্র সংঘ বিরাজ হে শুভ শঙ্খ বাজো বাজো হে বিশ্ববিদ্যাতীর্থ প্রাঙ্গণ পর মহোজ্জ্বল আজ হে শুভ শঙ্খ বাজো বাজো হে ঘন তিমির রাত্রির চির প্রতীক্ষা পূর্ণ করলহ জ্যোতি দীক্ষা যাত্রী দল সব সাজ হে দিব্য বীণা বাজ হে বল নরোত্তম পুরুষোত্তম জয় তপস্বী রাজ হে জয় হে জয় হে জয় হে জয় হে এসো কর্মী এসো জানো কল্যাণ ধ্যানী এসো কর্মী এসো জ্ঞানী এসো কর্মী এসো জ্ঞানী এসো জানো কল্যাণ ধ্যানী এসো হে ধী শক্তি সম্পদ মুক্ত বন্ধ সমাজ হে বীর ধর্মে পূর্ণ কর্মে বিশ্ব হৃদয়ে রাজ হে শুভ শঙ্খ বাজ বাজ হে বল জয় নরোত্তম পুরুষোত্তম জয় তপস্বী রাজ হে জয় হে জয় হে জয় হে জয় হে সকলকে ধন্যবাদ জানাই।
Thank you, Powal Banerjee. A nice inaugural song. Our webinar topic is Land, Water and Rural World, Experiential and Emotive Response in Colonial and Post-Colonial India. This topic is very significant today. The environmental agendas of the colonial and post-colonial period in India show a winsome continuity in their work continent. This continuity is also reflected in the underlying the principles of relates policies. The early attention of the British colonizer was almost exclusively focused on land, water, and consequently its rural life among all the natural resources of India. The environmental agenda was therefore set by British for the natural land and water. These objects was abundantly clear: conversion and utilization of land, water as a commodity gear for economy. Along similar lines, for the post-colonial period, some of the policy discussion mainly focused on its land-water projects in order to situate a distinct colony's life. This webinar may be looked at and beyond the cluster of dimension may constitute as colonial and post-colonial ecological doctrines and its criticism in order to consider the place of environmental, and in colonial and post-colonial historiography, emotive sensitivity to the tensions inherent in such a theme. Here, this webinar will examine the conversation and contradictions of colonial and post-colonial theories around a number of key themes, including knowledge and representation, indignity, gender, animals, justice, and the globalization in India. We hope towards to its end, it will be observed that in order to accomplish a broccoli life, much insights and theoretical friction may be gained from pursuing the conceptual nation of colonial and post-colonial conception of land and hydrology, which attempt to characterize both the colonial and post-colonial experience as compromising altogether a distinct paradigm for the study of land and hydraulic intervention in India. Now I request to Principal Dr. Manoj Kumar Boiddu to inaugurate the webinar and deliver his welcome address.
Thank you, Jagdeep. Good morning, everybody. It gives me immense pleasure to extend you all a very warm welcome on behalf of Malda College to the national level webinar on land, water, and rural world. I take this rare opportunity to welcome and express my sincere thanks and gratitude to all honorable speakers of today's webinar. I would also like to welcome to my dear students, teachers, guardians, and other participants present in this webinar. The spread of COVID-19 has affected almost all spheres of human life, physical, emotional, economic, and everything. COVID-19 crisis not only creates disaster, I think it also creates the opportunity to come together as one humankind. It also gives the opportunity to learn together, to grow together. It also makes us realize our mistakes towards the environment. So today's webinar, the topic of today's webinar is very relevant. At least we the people realize the effect of environment on the human life. So it is gratifying to note that agenda of today's webinar will cover all aspects of the environment issue, land, water, from the point of view of historical perspective and historical explanation. I hope today's webinar will be a grand success one. I congratulate all faculty members of the Department of History, Malda College, for organizing this relevant webinar. Now I like to conclude my welcome address and inaugurate this webinar by saying, learn together, grow together, stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your kind word. Now it's time for a keynote address. I request to Professor Bipasara, Department of History, Santiniketan Bolpur, to deliver her keynote address. She is a specialist in socioeconomic history in colonial India. She is a scholar of renowned Professor Binoy Bhushan Chaudhary. She has already done much remarkable work and published many research articles which are very important to us. Her path-breaking work is the plough and pen, agriculture, and the latinity in colonial Bengal. Her another book is Living a Dream, Rabindranath Tagore and Ruler, Rich and Citizen. Now I request Professor Bipasara to deliver his keynote address. Madam.
Thank you, Jagdeep. Am I audible? আমাকে কি শোনা যাচ্ছে?
হ্যাঁ, শোনা যাচ্ছে, শোনা যাচ্ছে।
Okay. Thank you once again for giving me this opportunity. Actually আমার সম্পর্কে এত এত কথা জগদীপ বললো, ও আমি অত ভয়ঙ্কর কিছু না, আমি অত্যন্ত সাধারণ এবং আমি খুব জাস্টিফাইবলি আজকে very nervous today because this is the first time that I'm presenting something on this kind of a meeting. But anyway, Jagdeep, how much time are you giving me? আমাকে কতটা সময় দিচ্ছ?
30 মিনিট, 30-40 মিনিট হলেই হবে।
Okay. Thank you. Okay, today what I'm going to talk about is I was given to understand that this was naturally a seminar on this environmental issue, so I chose a topic with which I am quite familiar. I've been working for years on this. Now, today I'm going to discuss Rabindranath, his rural reconstruction, some ideas of nature, and nature was very much present so in his work of rural reconstruction. Now, I would like to begin with something that Tagore himself said, and I quote from Tagore. I had such an exceeding love for nature that I cannot think in what way to describe it to you. But she was a kind of loving companion, always with me and always revealing to me some fresh beauty. This is said to C.F. Andrews, his great friend, and you will find it in the letters to a friend. Now, nature, this was something that was consistent, ever present in all his creations, his literary work, his thoughts, in every activity that he undertook. Now, this lecture today, I'm going to, there are three dimensions to it. First of all, I will discuss very briefly some of his relevant ideas, his thoughts and perceptions on nature. Second, in what way these elements of nature become crucial in his work of rural reconstruction. And third, how in this rural reconstruction program, he was doing his best to put his ideas into practice. Okay, now as far as nature was concerned, nature was, as I just said, that it was ever present. It was always there in his ideas. And I would say that he was one of the pioneering environmentalists, much before the West began to give so much of emphasis to environmental conservation of nature. He was doing this, I would put it from the time that he went to the village to take up the work of Zamindari administration from that time onwards. Now, see, from 1890s onwards, he was ever present in the village. His familiarity with the village began from that time onwards. Two things happened. One, his senses were dulled by the beauty of the nature that he saw over there. And the other was, he was also appalled, I would say, he was also becoming more and more aware that this elements of nature, the natural environment needed to be conserved. This needed to be protected from the destruction of human civilization. Now, what he wanted was some kind of a balance, a harmony between progress as well as preservation. And he was articulating this a century ago, more than a century ago. I would like to refer to an incident over here, and that happened much later, but which he would continue to reiterate in his thoughts later on, even later than that, 1916. So that was an eye-opener. He was appalled by man's treatment of nature, man's failure to respect nature. And he used his creativity to awaken a consciousness of nature, creating sensitivity. His poems, short stories, plays, songs, all these, they give us an idea about his thoughts on man's relationship with nature. He was emphasizing on the need to protect nature and Mother Earth. And he wrote at length on man's relationship with nature. And I would like to quote here something that he said to C.F. Andrews again. From the first time that I can remember, I was passionately fond of nature. Oh, it used to make me mad with joy when I saw the clouds come up in the sky one by one. I felt, even in those early days, that I was surrounded with a companionship, very intense and very intimate, though I do not know how to name it. I had such an exceeding love for nature that I cannot think in what way to describe it to you. But she was a kind of loving companion, always with me and always revealing to me some fresh beauty. Okay, so it was always there. And again, he writes in his reminiscences, from my earliest years, I enjoyed a simple and intimate communion with nature. His love for nature, skies, the spaciousness, the countryside, everything that symbolized to him some sort of freedom, you know. He had written about it many a times when he wrote about his experiences in school and how he wanted to move away from there. His literary creations, they reveal the intensity of his relationship with nature, wherein nature in her various modes inspired him. Now, today we do so many things to create an awareness, to build up a clean, a pollution-free world environment. We are talking about safe drinking water, we are talking about proper sanitation, we are talking about protecting the earth, saving the tree. And we have so many, we have marked certain days in our calendar for some specific purpose. We have like World Earth Day, World Environmental Day, etc., etc. But what is remarkable is that Tagore thought about all this, the importance of protecting nature, the environment, the greeneries, so many years ago. His poems talk about the beauty of nature. It talks about the attractions, the visuals that nature has to offer. But beyond that, also, what comes out is some kind of a divine presence that always revealed itself to Tagore. He was talking about some kind of a divine presence. So nature, it included the universe, and that universe included the creator, the cosmos, and all the creatures. His awareness of the divine in all the forms of nature are revealed in the rivers, the trees, the sky, the birds, so many things. And all that was given expression in his songs, in his poems. He wrote so many poems and which were also put to songs, glorifying nature. Now, Voice of the Forest, that revealed itself in him. His approach to nature is blended with feelings of affection, gratitude, as well as revereness, some sort of respect, some sort of eulogizing. This was always there. And there was a kind of relationship between humanity and nature, which he was trying to highlight throughout his work. In all his work, it is ever present. Nature was the mother of man. He believed that man is supposed to live in harmony with nature, to recognize the divinity that prevails in all elements, including the plants, the animals, everything. So nature was actually man's habitat, and that habitat had to be protected. nature without man would be like a broken arch, and man without nature would be nothing like a but a deserted land, Moruhumi. So he was pained, that when man, in the name of progress, was trying to exert its power, forgetting that nature was more powerful than a man could ever be. He was greatly pained by the overexploitation of nature. So he felt that nature was actually the greatest teacher. So when he had thought of his educational experiment in Shantiniketan, he always thought he chose a very rural setting. And so that in that rural setting, the children, that is future man, would be the future adults would be exposed to this kind of natural beauty. They would learn it from their childhood. So all these things, like, plantation day became Brick Koropon. It was one of the most precious days of in remembrance of new life. He said, and I quote again, while accepting gifts from nature, man became greedy. Distancing the forest, he won the lands for farming. Slowly, he removed the veil of shadow from the face of Mother Earth, leaving her denuded. Keeping this development in mind, I started the Plantation Day, a festival for an extravagant child to repay the burden of gifts by his caring mother. Then again, there was Holoportion, the furrowing of the soil, for farming. There were other festivals which were gradually introduced, like Bosantotsav. These were all the seasonal festivals. So he was, again, I would reiterate, one of the pioneers to promote the cause of preservation of nature and environment many, many years ago, many years ahead of his generation. Now, nature, the main elements of nature included earth, water, sun, air, the outer space. His description of nature, much of it was the result of his personal experience. His love for nature was all-inclusive, many-angled, and it was also realistic. It was the primeval storehouse of all life. He believed in divine presence in nature. And to him, nature was majestic, nature was life-giving, but he was also aware that nature had a destructive side to it also, a side that symbolized death after and also rebirth. So all these kind of things were there. These were different sides of his mental perception, his perception of nature. Now, his best experience of nature, feeling for nature, I would like to quote from his thoughts. I would just like to say, I believe that there is an ideal hovering over and permeating the earth, an ideal of that paradise which is not the mere outcome of fancy, but the ultimate reality in which all things are and towards which all things are moving. I believe that this vision of paradise is to be seen in the sunlight and the green of the earth, in the flowing streams, in the gladness of springtime, the repose of winter morning, in the beauty of a human face and the wealth of human love. Everywhere in this earth, the spirit of paradise is awake and sending forth his voice. It reaches our inner ears without our knowing it. It tunes our harp of life, urging us to send our aspiration beyond the finite, as flowers send their perfume into the air and the birds their songs. So these are some of his thoughts on nature. And, these thoughts were revealed in his conversations that he had with his friends, many of which were recorded later. Then there were the letters that he wrote in his literary creations. So everywhere that he put everything that he put his pen to, it was there, his expression of his feeling of nature. Now, having discussed some of his ideas on nature, I would now like to move on to the second and third part of my lecture, that is how these elements, how this nature, the natural world, his feeling for nature, his perception of the natural world, this molded his activities, particularly his activities with relation to rural reconstruction. Now, rural reconstruction was an activity that was undertaken by Tagore ever since he was sent to Shilaidaho by his father to look after the zamindari. And that was in the closing decade of the 19th century. Now, his program of rural development, it was multifarious, it was multidimensional. It was not just, they were related to revitalization of the rural economy. This was the period of the nationalist movement. Gradually, the nationalist movement was also gaining ground. And during this time of nationalist movement, he was offering a new dimension to the work that the leaders needed to undertake. Because from the beginning he felt that it was the villages that had been ruined by the colonial rule. Under colonial rule, the lifeblood of the villages had been drained away. So these villages needed to be revitalized, resuscitated. And so that was his work of rural reconstruction, Gram Punogothan, rural resuscitation, whichever way we may look at it, revitalization. Now, he considered the village as the nucleus of Indian civilization. So it was the village which had to be saved. The village as a whole consisted of different components. His long association with rural life awakened him to the multifarious needs of the hapless villagers. He gave great importance, again, at the same time, to nature and environment in his scheme of education and rural development. The three main elements of nature which became, or which was elemental but central to his work of rural reconstruction were air, soil, and that is earth, water, and air. Okay, these are the three main things that were very crucial to his work of rural reconstruction. He said, and this is said in the Message of the Forest, I quote, "So long as we disregard or misread the message of our ancient forests, the message of all-pervading truth in humanity, the message of all-comprehensive union of souls which rises above differences and goes deeper than mere expediency, we shall have to go on suffering sorrow after sorrow and endless humiliation and in all things misery." So this is something that he stuck to. And this he knew that even when we were talking about rural reconstruction, rural development, the natural world could not be ignored. It had to be a balanced development, a development that was in harmony with nature, with the natural world. And as I had said, that this awareness of nature, this was something that was there in him from his very early days. And the beauty of the natural world came to him in many hues, many colors, many dimensions, and this was repeatedly expressed in eloquent prose, poetry, everything, all his literary creations. Now, he believed, and I would like to refer to this, that the dominant attitudes of East and West originated in their respective relationships to the environment. The poet's own ideas on nature and environment were molded by his exposure to rural Bengal, his understanding of the impact of industrialization and modern civilization on natural resources. It may be argued that the poet believed that the stream of Indian civilization, which developed into a syncretic, non-violent society, is said to have evolved within the basically benign environment of the forest, where physical barriers were minimal and the connectedness with the outer world was assumed. Okay. Now, this is something that may be argued, and scholars have argued about this. Kathleen O'Connell, for example. Now, Indians have their own perception of the inner harmony of the universe and man's place in the natural world. And he always felt an urge to realize the inner beauty of nature. This was always there, and he repeatedly said so. It was always there. Now, he said somewhere that the aspect that is most important in nature is that it is full of beauty and joy. The natural world gives us so much beauty, so much joy. Okay. But the stream of Western civilization, on the other hand, which developed into a technologically developed society, it evolved within an essentially hostile natural environment. Consequently, many urban centers were constructed and a consciousness developed among people in the West which was alienated from nature. It inculcated a mentality of control over nature, competition, and power seeking. So there was some sort of a conflict over there. Now, he wrote, where Europe is too consciously busy in building up her power, defying her deeper nature and mocking it, she is heaping up on nature some sort of iniquities. She was harming the sky and, and spreading a lot of hostile infection or hostile elements into the natural world. In the name of commerce, in the name of development. And this was, in a way, outraging man's sense of the beautiful and the good. So, this kind of thoughts were expressed in his articles on nationalism. Now, nature to the poet was a living reality. He was an environmentalist and activist who attempted to translate his thoughts into practice. Conservation of the natural world, a harmonious blending of the natural and human world was to him imperative for the existence of mankind. He was aware of the detrimental effects of modern civilization on the environment and the environmental degradation that followed. So when he undertook his rural reconstruction work, he was emphatic that the environmental balance be maintained. This could be another way of development. He also stressed that a child's intimacy with nature was vital for his all-round development, and this was the foundation of his educational experiments. In his educational experiment, the curriculum was so structured that the students got the maximum opportunity of exposure to the natural world. He said that the first stage of a child's realization was through his feeling of intimacy with nature. And this was, in a way, the poet's experience. From a very young age, he was mesmerized by the issue of man's relationship with nature. And he was continuously holding a kind of dialogue with nature. He penned very eloquently, and I quote, "I came to the conclusion that it is because with us nature is obviously the more important thing. The sky is free, the fields limitless, and the sun merges into one blazing whole. In the midst of this, man seems so trivial." So these are some of his ideas that give us a glimpse into his perception of the natural world. When he undertook his rural reconstruction work, the importance of nature, the importance of preserving the natural world, that was given a lot of importance. As I said, the three main elements, earth, water, and air, the three main elements among the five of the natural world, these were given utmost emphasis here. Okay. Now, the poet, he said that the belief that the standard of living in modern civilization had been raised far higher than the average level of one's necessity. When this standard attained a degree that was a great deal above the normal, it encouraged the passion for greed. The temptation of an inordinately high level of living, which was once confined only to a small section of community, now became widespread. The burden was sure to prove fatal to the civilization, which put no restraint upon the emulation of self-indulgence. Where life was simple, said the poet, wealth did not become too exclusive, and owners of individual property found no great difficulty in acknowledging their communal responsibility. In fact, wealth could even become the best channel for social communication. In former days, he said, in India, public opinion levied heavy taxes upon wealth, and most of the public works of the country were voluntarily contributed by the rich. The water supply, medical help, education, amusement, these were maintained by men of property through spontaneous sense of mutual obligation. This was because of the limits set to individual right of self-indulgence, and the surplus wealth easily followed the channel of social responsibility. In such a society, civilization was supported by strong pillars of property, and wealth gave opportunity to the fortunate for self-sacrifice. But with the rise of the standard of living, property changed its aspects, its dimension. It shut the gate of hospitality, which was the best means of social communication. Its owners displayed their wealth in extravagance, which was self-centered. This created envy, irreconcilable class division. So, in other words, property became some kind of an anti-social, something that was not really socially beneficial. This universal greed now infected all. And this was the cause of misery, meanness, vanity, and these vitiated the whole human atmosphere. Now, when people's wants were moderate, said Tagore, and the pace of their, they did not exhaust the storehouse of wealth of nature. Consumption was at a low level, but with the ever-increasing greed, the store of sustenance was being exhausted. Because of this attempt to live at a pitch of monstrous excess. Mother Earth, he said, had enough for the healthy appetite of her children and something extra for rare cases of abnormality. But she did not have sufficient, warned the poet, for the sudden growth of the whole world of spoiled and pampered children. Conservation and proper utilization of the natural wealth was crucial for sustained well-being of mankind. Now, Elmhurst, who was the architect of this rural development program in Sriniketan. In this lecture, I'm actually concentrating on this Sriniketan phase because had I brought in the other two phases at Shilaidaho and then Potishwar, the lecture would have become too long. Now, the Elmhurst, he was in total agreement with the poet in this view of nature, in this perception of nature and the exploitation of nature by man in the name of development. And Sriniketan, this is in the Birbhum area, in the Birbhum district, Elmas referred to the grinding poverty and the frequency of famines that plagued life in the Birbhum region. And he said that however much we may refer to malaria, refer to disease to malaria as being probable causes of increasing death rate, the main reason was the treatment of the soil. What lay at the bottom of the problem was the treatment of the soil. So soil, that is Mother Earth, that is the element earth among the 5 elements of nature. In a rural country, the soil was the main source of wealth. Yet the people of Birbhum were not succeeding in extracting sufficient wealth from the soil for their sustenance. The Birbhum area was one of the richest at one time and supported cultivation a large part of the community. But what happened was, over the years, community life was affected adversely. This is proved by the ruin of the ancient temples and the remnants of the once thriving irrigation systems. Okay. Now, robbery of the soil, this is what they said. This robbery of the soil could not go on forever. This had to stop. Fundamental among nature's laws, said Elmas, was that which allowed no race of farmers to take more out of the soil than they put in. Now, for rural development work to succeed, scientific farming had to be carried on. So, what I'm trying to discuss is how these ideas about preservation of nature were given practical application in the work of rural reconstruction. So what I'm trying to say is that Rabindranath, he did not just propound theories about how natural world could be saved, how natural world could be conserved. What he was also an activist to an extent that in the work that he undertook, he was trying to give practical application to many of his theories. Scientific farming, this is something which Tagore, as well as his friend Elmas, they agreed upon. This was crucial for the success of rural reconstruction work. Without scientific farming, there could be no possibility of rural revitalization, no possibility of the farmers in Bengal ever being able to improve their lot. Without scientific farming, poverty, which was the bane of rural life, could never really be abolished. But where scientific farming was being undertaken, it was also necessary to ensure that soil was being generously repaid for what was being taken away from soil. In the olden days, enough land was cultivated to give the village population the food it needed. Firewood came from the grazing grounds and forests, and slack times were spent in manufacturing from raw products, articles for household use, or for exchange, goods which could also be exchanged, only if there was a market nearby to which safe export was possible. The production of food was a community enterprise, and the proper treatment of the soil with irrigation and manure was a communal responsibility. But with the insatiable demand for modern city, with easy means of communication, all this harmony was gone. He who could steal most from the soil and ship it off in return for money survived, said Elmas, and his less fortunate neighbors perished. The soil was the only available source of nitrogen, iron, lime, potassium, sulfur, etc. and the other elements which composed composed of animal and human body, this was also being drawn from the soil in the name of scientific agriculture. But to continue indefinitely extraction of these elements from the soil, Elmer said the future generations could only be provided for if the soil was replenished, if these elements could be replenished. This drain upon the soil had to stop. For this, proper procedure was adopted in the rural reconstruction work. In the agricultural experiments that were undertaken in Sriniketan, care was ensured that this robbery of the soil did not continue. And I would like to stress here that what Tagore was doing in Sriniketan, he said that this was to be a model. He could not undertake the responsibility for the whole world. So what he was doing, his experiment was to be a model which was to be replicated by others elsewhere. To prevent this extraction, uncontrolled extraction from the soil, Elmhurst, who was echoing many of the sentiments of the poet, they believed that tenant farming would be disastrous for the soil. The tenant, why? Because the tenant had no permanent interest in the fertility and only carried on those activities that would give him a living without bringing on a rise in the rent. The city took all. They returned little or nothing of real value to the soil. But worst of all, the spirit of independence, of good fellowship, of common suffering and service, of common recreation, rejoicing and worship, all this had disappeared. In the search for more and more economic gains, in the search for amenities of civilization, of all the thieves, the cities were the most ruthless. In the race to satisfy their demands, the contemporarily individualistic type of society with its enslavement of the uneducated masses has obliterated completely the old common life in which all, from the Brahmin at the top to the laborers at the bottom, were servants of the common welfare. So, the soil had to be saved. And in this exercise, the health of the people had also to be restored. And for that, again, it had to be ensured that malaria, mosquito, flies, and the harmful bacteria did not have a free field. The unclean tanks formed death traps, and railway embankments were veritable breeding grounds for mosquitoes. Rivers that were once free and easy-flowing, navigable streams had all silted up. So the village was actually losing its lifeblood. And besides, there was also a continuous drain of the population from the village to the countryside. All this had to be checked. What is most important, because of these railway embankments, because of this continuous furrowing, the top soil, the upper soil was being washed away by heavy drainage, heavy rains, and this was leaving the lower soil, the inner soil, unprotected. So the question of soil conservation in lateritic soil condition becomes vital because of the typical mineralogical composition of the laterite and the climatic condition working upon it, which makes it prone to severe erosion. From the time of Elmer's, that is from the time that rural reconstruction work started in Sriniketan, attempts were undertaken to address the problem of soil erosion. And as a result of this, many programs were undertaken. Afforestation programs were adopted, various kinds of trees for timber as well as for fuel were planted. And from the 1940s onwards, and even even after the death of the poet, vigorous attempts were made in this direction. Here, the something that I found in the Vishwabharati annual report of 1940. Two experiments, I quote, two experiments of considerable importance to the rural economy of the district and West Bengal in general were undertaken during the present year, that is 1940. One was afforestation of the bare lands, most of which are now denuded of trees. The land around Chipkuti has been selected for this experiment, where various kinds of trees for timber as well as for fuel have been planted. In spite of the limited funds at the disposal of this institute, experiments to find out the best methods of preventing soil erosion have been started. Now, so this is this kind of attempt to prevent soil erosion, it continues even later. Like, for example, the next year, the Imperial Council of Agricultural Research, it sanctioned an amount of 17,000 rupees for the studying of the problem of the soil erosion of the area. And it was also reported later that in 1943, that is even after the poet had gone, had left the world, that here, as well as some other districts like Bankura and adjoining regions, there were attempts to study and address the problem of soil erosion. So in a way, I would say that Tagore's work was in some way a pioneering enterprise. Now, collective efforts were made by the workers of the Institute of Rural Reconstruction over here in Sriniketan to find ways and means to implement methods of soil conservation even after Elmhurst had left the institute and even later after the poet had departed. So soil conservation, as I just said, that protecting one of the vital elements of nature was given utmost importance. I will mention an instance. Purnamoy Sen, a botanist who was engaged for the work, was sent to Cornell University to study. Later, this happened later, to study scientific methods of soil conservation in 1946. Again, a little earlier, in 1945, D.V. Schuhart, an American expert in soil conservation, he visited Sriniketan, here, this side. So, this is one aspect of rural reconstruction work, where it is very clear that the natural environment, nature, was always given prime importance here. Again, then there was water, another element, okay? Now here also water. This water is another element that had to be given focus, emphasis, and Tagore very clearly said that there are two aspects of water. That is, one is drainage of the unclean water and provision of clean water for drinking and all other purpose. Okay, so this also was seen to. Now, here in Shantiniketan, Sriniketan area, or that is in this experiment, water bodies had a place. The construction of Lalma, the water body, was undertaken. This was a part of the soil conservation process which was undertaken. Now, it was later reported that a tank was excavated over here, and a large part of the money was forwarded. A large part of the money came from the institute, as well as the government even advanced. Okay. And the new tank that was opened, this was, it caught the imagination of the local people, and one aim was provision of clear drinking water. Here also other activities were undertaken, like pisciculture, and it had an educational value also. Okay. Now, so in a nutshell, I've discussed two elements of nature that were conservation of which, protection of which was undertaken over here. And the third part that I said was air, that is pollution-free air. This is also something that the poet had repeatedly mentioned in his work, and this was also, it was also ensured that this was something that was looked after. And this environment, all these issues of environment that were being looked into, this had another relevance. You see, today we talk about human resource development, but when the poet was undertaking this, food, economic development are necessary elements for proper living. Similarly, health is another part, another aspect that is necessary for the development of the country also. And as a result, to ensure proper health, there were two aspects of health which were looked into, the preventive and the curative aspect of health. Curative would be the diseases that were rampant over here, and how the health workers, health cooperatives were organized, and health workers were organized, and they were instructed to go and promote an awareness of health in the local country, in the adjoining countryside. But at the same time, there is also a preventive aspect to health. That is to prevent diseases. And this prevention, disease, healthy living, this is a conception that was there in Tagore even from the late 19th century, I would say, because he was from his very early youth, at his house in Jora Shako, they were made aware of the necessity of healthy living. Okay, I'm not going into the details of this, but maybe later if you ask, I can explain. Now, so as far as the preventive side of health is concerned, this is something that the health workers were instructed to do. They have to go to the villages and they have to undertake undertake a promotion of awareness of healthy living condition. For that, the surroundings, the environment in which the local people lived, that had to be ensured that it was conducive to good health. So, there is mention of efforts made to kerosenize the area adjoining the house, the effort to clean up the water bodies so that mosquito, malaria, it didn't become a breeding ground for mosquito, malaria could be arrested. Again, proper health could be ensured by providing healthy environment in which people could live, how shrubs, parasitic plants, this could be cleared, the area adjoining the house could be free of these growth of plantation which would not be conducive for health, which could be the breeding ground for mosquitoes. Okay, so in a way, I have tried to explain how these three, the elements of the natural world, they were ever present in any activity undertaken for promotion of rural reconstruction work. As far as the other elements, the universe, the cosmos, the outer space, then sun, these are these were also ever present in his literary creations, and people, and there was no problem with sunlight, of course, in the rural areas. But if you, I would just like to conclude making a few statements. If you look at the architectural design that of the buildings that were undertaken over here, you'll see they're not very high, low, just one story, which afforded maximization of exposure to the natural element. So I would like to wind up just saying that by repeating and reiterating that Tagore in his own way was not what I would call an armchair theorist, somebody who was only propounding ideas. He was also somebody for whom nature was a living entity, something that was ever present. And it was present, the natural world and the rural world could never really be separated. When he undertook the resuscitation of the rural world, resuscitation of the rural villages, it was with clear understanding of the place of nature in his scheme of activity. So having said that, I would like to end now. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share with you some of my ideas on what Tagore, who I believe was much more, I mean, there was more to Tagore. And as we delve more and more into his writings, his work, I always find that there were there was more to him. So much that even a whole life spent on reading and looking after reading his works, getting acquainted with what he thought and wrote, a lifetime is not sufficient. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for enriching us. Now I request to Dr. Pulumi Pal, Assistant Professor, Department of History, Malda College, for a vote of thanks. Pulumi, ready? Pulumi, ready now?
Indeed, a great pleasure on my part to give the vote of thanks to the learned speakers, audience, history, biology, and other subjects. Once more, the president of Webiner, IPC coordinator, Mr. Head of the department, Mr. PD coordinator, Mr. a renowned scholar, has presented as a lot of information about natural and rural, the two worlds of it. Presented this idea of the practice is beautiful. A mastery with the subject. Again, I'm extending my thanks for principal sir, for two technical assistants, Mr. B. and Dr. and my departmental head, coordinator and Michael and our part to make the webinar successful. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pulumi Pal. Now it's time for plenary session. This plenary session will be chaired by Professor Bipasa Raha, Department of History, Shantiniketan, Bolpur. Two renowned speakers are Dr. Subhayu Chattopadhyay, Department of History, Vishwabharati, Bolpur, and another speaker, Rajshekhar Basu, Department of History, Calcutta University, Calcutta. I request to Professor Bipasa Raha to take the chair. And now the first person speaker, Dr. Subhayu Chattopadhyay, Department of History, Vishwabharati, Bolpur. He is well known among his students, always cheer, and he loves performing in theatre. His more knowledgeable book is Mapping the Path and Maturity, a Connected History of Bengal and the. This book is very relevant for as far as the present academic world is connected. Now I request Dr. Subhayu Chattopadhyay to speak his topic, His topic is revisiting Aranyok, confluence of nature and literature. Sir, uh,
Bipashadi, may I start?
Hello. Can you hear me? Am I audible?
Bipashadi,
Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
শুভায়ু জগদীপ অনেকগুলো মাইক্রোফোন অন আছে তার জন্য শোনা যাচ্ছে না মেনি মাইক্রোফোনস আর অন ওকে আমারটা শুনতে পাচ্ছ শুভায়ু ক্যান ইউ হিয়ার মি ওকে সো শুভায়ু you may start Shubhayu your topic has already been stated by Jagdeep so start okay I am very happy to have Shubhayu here my student and colleague. Shubhayu, start. Bolo, shuru. Shubhayu, আবার বলো।
বের করছি তো। হ্যাঁ স্যার। হ্যালো স্যার।
স্যার একটু আনমিউট করেন
আনমিউট করুন
Am I audible?
yes
sir yes sir
Respected Chairperson Professor Bipasha Raha, the Principal of Malda College, Professor Rajshekhar Basu, Sri Jagdeep Chauhan, the convener of this webinar, my colleagues and all of you virtually present at this moment. Good afternoon to you all. My topic for today's discussion is, as you know, revisiting Aranyok, confabulation of nature and literature. But I think I should try to explain why I have taken up this particular literary text for today's discussion. Aranyok, written by Bibhuti Bhushan Bandyopadhyay, is a widely read literary masterpiece for generations. Now, how could this novel, so familiar a name, suddenly enters into an academic discussion needs justification, at least from my end. First of all, for me, Aranyok is a classic example where the author has made a brilliant juxtaposition of two worlds, characteristically different from each other. Second, it has successfully upheld a binary. On the one hand, there is a city life of Calcutta with all modern amenities, and on the other, there is a vast area of unexplored jungle land in Purnia district of Bihar, with its flora, fauna, mineral resources, and of course, the people, the original inhabitants of that land, living in harmony. There lies a man, city-bred Shottacharan, the protagonist of this novel, in between these two worlds. It is the gradual transformation process of Shottacharan's mental world that is woven throughout the novel. Last but not the least, Aranyok, composed during 1937-39 and published in 1976, should not be considered entirely a work of fiction or imagination, as Vibhuti Bhushan, the author himself, worked as an assistant manager from 1924 to 1930 for the Pathuria Ghata Zamindari estate in Bhagalpur, North Bihar. And that might have definitely helped him while writing this novel. But apart from this, the novel, since its publication, has been continuously doing one thing till date, that is, to prick conscience of its present readers, who are mostly inclined to complex life of modern amenities, about a lost era, which was difficult to live, yet was full of life force. Aranyok reiterates the point that everything changes, but change should not lead to extinction, which in this case might have happened due to that old story of commercial exploitation of nature. These are some of my initial reasons for choosing Aranyak for today's discussion. I should say at this moment that the convener, Sri Chauhan, has said that for this presentation or discussion, bilingual mode would be preferred. It is even better for me that I don't have to translate Vibhuti Bhushan's magical Bengali and I can quote straight from his novel whenever required. I've been given 40 minutes of time. I hope I should wrap it up within that time only. Literature has a unique relationship with history and society. First, there is no scope of imagination in history as it is bound by facts. However, literature doesn't have any such obligation, and it may create an imaginary world which can be useful to understand the inner spirit of that particular text. For example, a student of history is confined within the files of archives, even he or she is engaged with the study of partition of India. But the scholar will never get to understand the milieu until and unless he or she goes through the partition literature. Second, history speaks of human progress in collective term, whereas literature can delve into the inner self of one individual, but history cannot do. Finally, both history and literature deal with human beings and both depend on each other to understand a particular age and the human reaction to it. Towards the end of the previous century, a new era of studying literature came into existence. It is a scholarly approach to study nature writing, which is popularly known as eco-criticism. This environmentally oriented study of literature is also known as environmental literary criticism, green studies, etc. Eco-criticism as an academic discipline arose during the last decade of the 20th century when Cheryl Glotfetti and Harold Fromm published a book named The Eco-Criticism Reader, an anthology of critical essays on nature. Eco-criticism, what is that? It pleads for a symbiosis, which suggests an ecological relationship between the human and the non-human. There was an age when man used to live in harmony with the nature as an integral part of it. But as the time progressed, his materialistic attitude led him to look upon nature as a commodity, thereby creating a deep imbalance by establishing a commercially oriented anthropomorphic superiority over the nature. Here lies the importance of this new study, that is eco-criticism, which tries to remind us the locus standi of us, that is the self-oriented human beings of today, vis-a-vis the nature with all its components. The novel Aranyak, according to me, fits into that role perfectly. Vibhuti Bhushan begins his novel with a confession that he is going to share his reminiscences of a place, of a time, with his readers, only to lessen his heap of guilt, the guilt of being instrumental in destroying that virgin forest land. I quote Vibhuti Bhushan. জগতের যে পথে সভ্য মানুষের চলাচল কম, কত অদ্ভুত জীবনধারার স্রোত আপন মনে উপল বিকীর্ণ অজানা নদী খাত দিয়া ঝিরঝির করিয়া বহিয়া চলে সে পথে, তাহাদের সাথে পরিচয় স্মৃতি আজও ভুলিতে পারি নাই। কিন্তু আমার এই স্মৃতি আনন্দের নয়, দুঃখে। এই স্বচ্ছন্দ প্রকৃতি লীলাভূমি আমার হাতেই বিনষ্ট হইয়াছিল, বনের দেবতারা সেজন্য আমায় কখনো ক্ষমা করবেন না জানি। নিজের অপরাধের কথা নিজের মুখে বলিলে অপরাধের ভার শুনিয়াছি লঘু হইয়া যায়। তাই এই কাহিনীর অবতারণা। From the very beginning, the author successfully creates an ambience of curiosity among the readers to know of his guilt. The masterstroke comes at the end of the novel, when the reader also gets involved into the process and understands the guilt as his own also. As I have mentioned that His novel narrates the journey of the protagonist Sottocharan in the dichotomy of the urban and jungle lives. During the intervening period of two world wars, when unemployment, uncertainty were very common among the urban youth of Calcutta, Sottocharan gets the job of an assistant manager in the Purnia district of North Bihar. The Chotanagpur Plateau area is filled up with dense forest, where his master has 30,000 bighas of land. Sottocharan was assigned the post of the manager, who is to set up new habitation in the area by clearing up the jungle that would provide his master with huge revenue. Initially, the city-bred Sottocharan, who has taken up the job out of compulsion, has no love for the jungle life. The loneliness of the forest troubled him so much that he started to repent for taking up the job. He felt that he, all alone in this world of frightful jungle, is distanced by several light years from his life in Calcutta, with his companions enjoying libraries, theaters, films, and music, without which he could not have imagined a life. To him, the people in the kachari or his office were as good as barbarians who could not even understand his words. I quote, এদেশের এইসব মূর্খ বর্বর মানুষ এরা একটা ভালো কথা বলিলে বুঝিতে পারে না, এদেরই সাহচর্যে দিনের পর দিন কাটাইতে হইবে। সংকল্প করিলাম একখানা লম্বা পত্র লিখিয়া চাকুরিতে ইস্তফা দিয়া কলিকাতায় ফিরিয়া গিয়া সভ্য বন্ধু বান্ধবদের অভ্যর্থনা পাইয়া সভ্য খাদ্য খাইয়া সভ্য সুরের সঙ্গীত শুনিয়া মানুষের ভিড়ের মধ্যে ঢুকিয়া বহু মানবের আনন্দ উল্লাস ভরা কণ্ঠস্বর শুনিয়া বাঁচি। But the jungle and its people, which looked suffocating and savage initially, gradually got assimilated with his self so much in no time that he could not think of returning to the same old city life of Calcutta for which he yearned initially. He recollects, I quote, almost 3 years have gone by. I have gone through many changes in the 3 years. Nature in and around Loptulia and Ajmabad has so captivated me that I have almost forgotten the city. I'm so drawn to the attractions of solitude, of the constellated open sky, that once, when I had got to Patna only for a few days, I suffered greatly from the narrow, tarred roads and longed to return to Loptulia Bihar. He was equally mesmerized by the life force of the people, who were otherwise drowned in stark poverty. The author says, ইহাদের দারিদ্র, সারল্য, কঠোর জীবন সংগ্রামে ইহাদের যুঝিবার ক্ষমতা, এই অন্ধকার আরণ্য ভূমি ও হিমবর্ষী মুক্ত আকাশ বিলাসিতার কোমল পুষ্পাস্ত্র পথে ইহাদের যাইতে দেন না, কিন্তু ইহাদেরকে সত্যকার পুরুষ মানুষ করিয়া গড়িয়াছে। দুটি ভাত খাইতে পাওয়ার আনন্দে যারা ভীমদাসটোলা ও পর্বতা হইতে 9 মাইল পথ হাঁটিয়া আসিয়াছে বিনা নিমন্ত্রণে, তাহাদের মনের আনন্দ গ্রহণ করিবার শক্তি কত সতেজ ভাবিয়া বিস্মিত হইলাম। As days went by, Sottocharan got increasingly and happily ensnared by the fascination of the forest land and its people. Vibhibhushan in Aranyok has present a detailed picture of a geographical landmass rich with flora, fauna, mineral resources. His portrayal of the people of the land living in abject poverty only makes us to understand that they have accepted exploitation as their destiny. In exchange, they want the bare minimum, food and shelter. Be it the natural diversity or the profile of the habitation, the reader of the post-independent India found in Aranyok a treasure of information as well as a whip on the corrective mood of blissful oblivion. What about flora? Vibhibhushan in this fine narrative prose mentioned a number of plants, creepers, shrubs, and trees. I will simply refer to some of them, following the author, without taking the pain to translate their names, otherwise they might appear alien. He mentions Phool, Asan, Bonjhau, Dudhili Phool, Kashbon, Gurumi, Horitoki, etc. Apart from plants like white beam, red campion, stitchwort, foxglove, wood anemone, dog rose, honeysuckle, etc. I have consciously eliminated names like the common ones like bunions or shawls or mohua that I have eliminated. What about fauna? What did he write about fauna? It is indeed a treat to read Aranya, only because of the fact that it introduces us to such a wide variety of animal species. The author mentions all kinds of wild animals present in the jungle land, along with regular cattle. In addition, he mentions a range of birds, among which some uncommon names like Sinni, Pullo, Bajbori, Manikpakhi, Hortit were also present. The author mentions about the mineral resources. He mentions about iron and pyrite in abundance in the area. It should be mentioned here in this connection that this entire region, previously under the Mayurbhanj district, was rich in mineral resources. Almost 30 years before the composition of Aranya, Pramodnath Bose discovered huge iron ore in the Guru Mahishani Hills, which is approximately 450 to 500 miles away from this jungle land of Pune. And that discovery led to the foundation of Tisco, the first heavy industry of the country that we all know. So, Vibhutibhushan mentions about the mineral resources of this jungle land also. Aranya, the novel, deals at length the interdependence between human and nature, which is the true spirit of eco-criticism. During his survey work of the huge jungle land, Chattocharan came to know about the daily lives of men and women who depend on the resources of the forest for their very sustenance. Wife of Rakhal Babu, Kunta, Monchi, Bhanumati, add to the beauty of the forest for their spontaneous natural selves. One sees a gradual change in Chattocharan's attitude towards nature. Once the votary of urban life, Chattocharan now has transformed into a devoted lover of nature in her pristine beauty. He enjoys long horse rides into the dense forest on a moonlit night. He even sends Jugal Prasad with enough money to the impenetrable forest of Jayanti Hills to bring saplings of Dudhia flower for beautification of Saraswati Kundi, where variety of amazing birds like magpies, pheasant crows, wild parrots, sparrows, Kubu, Harial, Shama, Hartit flock to take shelter. He enjoys wondrous solitude in the unbroken quiet of Saraswati Kundi, which serves as a heaven to him with its honeybee creepers, wild shivli, and its supernatural surroundings. In this forest, Chattocharan met with strange people like Raju Pare, Jugal Prasad, or Motuknath Pare, or even Dhautal Shah. Author says about his new addiction about the forest. পেয়ালার মতো উপুর করা নীল আকাশের তলে, মাঠের পরে মাঠ, অরণ্যের পরে অরণ্য, যেখানে তৈরি রাজপথ নাই, ইটের ঘরবাড়ি নাই, মোটর হর্নের আওয়াজ নাই, ঘন ঘুমের ফাঁকে যেখানে কেবল দূর অন্ধকার বনে শেয়ালের দলের প্রহর ঘোষণা শোনা যায়, নয়তো ধাবমান নীলগাইয়ের দলের সম্মিলিত পদধ্বনি, নয়তো বন্য মহিষের গম্ভীর আওয়াজ. So we can well understand that slowly but steadily Chattocharan is developing an addiction towards this jungle land. And there he met people like Raju Pare, Jugal Prasad, Motuknath Pare, Dhautal Sahu. All of them left permanent impression on Chattocharan, either by their philosophical bent of mind or their detachment towards material life. The author depicts the character of a moneylender like Dhautal Sahu, who cannot claim back his money from the people just because he cannot force them. Motuknath dreams of a toll amidst a vast forest land where he would groom the young boys in Sanskrit literature and theology. He sticks to his dream for long, and finally, to everybody's surprise, he succeeds. Jugal Prasad was given a strip of land to produce his own subsistence, lives in a different world. He brings rare flowers, creepers, or orchids from distant places only to beautify this forest land. Though there were people like Nandalal Ojha or Chotu Singh who exploit nature for their own interests, A stronger contrast comes out through the portrayals of nature-oriented people like Jugal Prasad or Motiknar or Daldas. Aranyok tells about the indigenous people of India, like the Gangotas, the Santhals, the vagrant dwellers, etc., to many of whom the Zamindar is not willing to give a settlement. 30 years ago, the land was swallowed into the womb of the river, surfacing again as chore land 20 years later. But those who found their ancestral land broken up by the Ganga thronged to reclaim them. The landlord deprived them of their right to forest land for earning higher revenue from the new rights. Shottocharan was assigned the duty of recruiting new people and distributing this land among them with a new rate of revenue. There was also a place nearby called Loptulia, which is leased out to the concerned parties for pastoral activities. Shottocharan has to monitor these different types of activities, which slowly but steadily change the landscape of the entire region. These ethnic people work hard and want less. They're blissfully oblivious about the march of modernity taking place somewhere else on this earth. Most of them are driven the whole day by the smell of their food. And what was the food? A bowl of boiled grass to be cooked at the evening. They sweat, they sing, they sleep in a different world. The author raises a very pertinent question in regard to them. বুঝি না কেন এক এক জাতির মধ্যে সভ্যতার কি বীজ লুক্কায়িত থাকে, তাহারা যত দিন যায় উন্নতি করে, আবার অন্য জাতি হাজার বছর ধরিয়াও সেই এক স্থানে স্থাণুবৎ নিশ্চল হইয়া থাকে কেন? বর্বর আর্য জাতি ৪-৫ হাজার বছরের মধ্যে বেদ, উপনিষদ, পুরাণ, কাব্য, জ্যোতির্বিদ্যা, জ্যামিতি, চরক, সুশ্রুত লিখিল, দেশ জয় করিল, সাম্রাজ্য পত্তন করিল, ভেনাস দ্য মিলর মূর্তি, পার্থেনন, তাজমহল গড়িল, দরবারি কানাডা 5th সিম্ফনি সৃষ্টি করিল, এরোপ্লেন, জাহাজ, রেলগাড়ি, বেতার, বিদ্যুৎ আবিষ্কার করিল, অথচ পাপুয়া নিউগিনি, অস্ট্রেলিয়ার আদিম অধিবাসীরা, আমাদের দেশের ওই মুন্ডা, কোল, নাগা, কুকিগণ যেখানে সেখানেই কেন রহিয়াছে এই ৫,০০০ বছর? The author raises this question. Shottocharan finds most of the people of Purnia jungle estate as working hard irrespective of the climatic changes to earn their livelihood. The male members of the families toil throughout the day, even in their old ages. The female members also accompany them on the field in addition to their household activities. Shottocharan notices a natural glow of health among the female members of the families. However, they are superstitious and not conscious, not at all conscious of the modern medicine of the civilized world. The author describes in the novel about the outbreak of Asiatic cholera. Some moments come in history when man stands and stares aghast the sight of devastation. You might easily find, all of you might easily find a similarity with recent times if I quote some of the lines Vibhuti Bhushan used in this respect. And we should keep in mind that he composed this novel just before the Second World War. I quote, প্রতিদিন এত লোক মরিতে লাগিল যে কুশি নদীর জলে সর্বত্র মরা ভাসিয়া যাইতেছে, দাহ করিবার ব্যবস্থা নাই। কি ভয়ানক দারিদ্র্যের মূর্তি কুটিরে কুটিরে। সবই খোলার কিংবা খড়ের বাড়ি, ছোট্ট ছোট্ট ঘর, জানালা নাই, আলো বাতাস ঢোকে না কোনো ঘরে। প্রায় সব ঘরেই দু একটি রোগী, ঘরের মেঝেতে ময়লা বিছানায় শুইয়া, ডাক্তার নাই, ওষুধ নাই, পথ্য নাই। হঠাৎ চোখে পড়িল রোগীর শিয়রের দিকে। তাকের উপর একটা আঢাকা পাথরের খোড়ায় 2টি পান্তা ভাত, ভাতের ওপর 10টি মাছি বসিয়া আছে। কি সর্বনাশ! ভীষণ এশিয়াটিক কলেরার রোগী ঘরে, আর রোগীর নিকট হইতে 3 হাতের মধ্যে ঢাকাবিহীন খোড়ায় ভাত। গ্রামের লোক স্বাস্থ্যের নিয়ম একেবারে জানে না। একটি মাত্র পুকুর, সেই পুকুরেই কাপড় কাচে, সেখানেই স্নান করে। স্নান করা আর জল পান করা যে একই কথা নয়, ইহা কিছুতেই তাহাদের বুঝাইতে পারিলাম না। রোগের গল্প, মৃত্যুর খবর ছাড়া ইহাদের মুখে অন্য কোনো কথা নাই। সকলেরই মুখে একটা ভয়, আতঙ্কের চিহ্ন পরিস্ফুট, কাহার পালা আসে। আমরা না থাকিলে তাহার মৃতদেহ কেহ বাহির করিতে আসিত কিনা সন্দেহ। আমাদের অনেক তদবির অনুরোধে জন্দুই আহির চাষি বাঁশ লইয়া আসিয়া মৃতদেহ বাঁশের সাহায্যে ঠেলিতে ঠেলিতে নদীর দিকে লইয়া গেল। Now, with these few quotes, you all would agree with me that some things, like people's treatment towards the affected, don't change in a situation like epidemic or pandemic. Even with a gap of more than 80 years, be it Asiatic cholera or corona, we react the same way. During his course of survey of the area, came across a person called Dobru Panna, the tribal king of the area. Once upon a time, whose predecessors were the rulers of this entire land, stretching from the Himalayas on the north, the river Kushi on the east, Chotanagpur to the south, and Mungir to the west. They fought with the Mughal army when the latter tried to invade Bengal, where decadence started with the posting of Mughal subedars in Rajmahal area. The last nail on the coffin was the Santhal rebellion, after which they lost their glory and power. Dobru Panna Birborhi, who was still alive, fought with the English East India Company during the Santhal rebellion. Chottocharan found Dobru Panna as a very old but alert man. He has a distant reverence for the city called Calcutta. He is very conscious of his royal past, and it seems that apart from his legacy, he is not interested in anything else in the outside world. He said, এখন আর কি আছে? আমাদের বংশ সূর্য বংশ। এই পাহাড় জঙ্গল সারা পৃথিবী আমাদের রাজ্য ছিল। আমি যৌবন বয়সে কোম্পানির সঙ্গে লড়েছি। এখন আমার বয়স অনেক। যুদ্ধে হেরে গেলাম, তারপর আর কিছু না। Chottocharan finds the king interesting, as he was quite agile and basking in the glory of his forefathers. Bhanumati, the princess, also came, and all of them went to visit the royal burial ground. On reaching the site, there was a sudden realization that struck Chottocharan. আমার মনে এমন একটা ভাব হইল, এতক্ষণ কোথাও হয় নাই। রাজাকে দেখিয়াও না, রাজাকে তো মনে হইয়াছে জনৈক বৃদ্ধ সাঁওতাল কুলির মতো। রাজকন্যাকে দেখিয়াও নয়, একটা স্বাস্থ্যবতী হোক কিংবা মুন্ডা তরুণীর সহিত রাজকন্যা কোনো প্রভেদ দেখি নাই। রাজপ্রাসাদ দেখিয়া তো নয়ই, সেটাকে একটা সাপখোপের ও ভূতের আড্ডা বলিয়া মনে হইয়াছে। কিন্তু পাহাড়ের উপর এই সুশাল প্রাচীন বটতরু তলে কতকালের এই সমাধিস্থল আমার মনে এক অননুভূত অপরূপ অনুভূতি জাগাইল। তখন বেলা প্রায় হেলিয়া পড়িয়াছে, হলদে রোদ পত্র রাশির গায়ে, ডাল ও ঝুড়ির অরণ্যে, দূর বনের মাথায়। অপরাহ্নের সেই ঘনায়মান ছায়া এই সুপ্রাচীন রাজসমাধিকে যেন আরো গম্ভীর রহস্যময় সৌন্দর্য দান করিল। There's an interesting analysis about existence of pre-nationalism by C.A. Bailey in different parts of India, even before the nation-in-making stage began. How all those sense of territoriality got mixed with one another to form a grand narrative of nationalism in India is a matter of debate. But here in this case, it is obvious that this old tribal kingdom is decaying every day in a remote corner of the country, completely outclassed from the mainstream of Indian nationalism. It becomes further evident when Shotto asked Bhanumati, the princess, which direction is Bharatvarsha? She looks astonishingly as she has never heard of this name. I wish I could explain this ignorance as a royal indifference on behalf of a princess of a long forgotten royal family towards an independence aspiring nation, rather than the treatment meted out to them by the elitist nationalist struggle of colonial India. As the forest of Loktulia was disappearing fast, the charm of Chottocharan began to wane. He makes a final decision to leave Bihar. He knows that he has a role in converting this virgin forest land into a place of dense human habitation, that too without being able to protect the serenity of the place. Chottocharan, to his horror, thinks of a scene where তামার কারখানা, চিমনি, ট্রলি লাইন, সারি সারি কুলি বস্তি, ময়লা জলের ড্রেন, ইঞ্জিন ঝাড়া কয়লা ছাইয়ে স্তূপ, দোকান ঘর, চায়ের দোকান, সস্তা সিনেমায় জবানি হাওয়া, প্রণয়ের জের, দেশি মদের দোকান, দর্জির দোকান, হোমিও ফার্মেসি, আদি অকৃত্রিম আদর্শ হিন্দু হোটেল, কলের বাঁশিতে ৩টার সিটি বাজিল, ভানুমতি মাথায় করিয়া ইঞ্জিনের ঝাড়া কয়লা বাজারে ফিরি করিতে বাহির হইয়াছে, কয়লা চাই, ৪ পয়সা ঝুরি। He beseeches forgiveness from the devastated nature goddess of Purikya. You, the primordial deity of wilderness, forgive me and you. He cannot reconcile himself with the fact that he himself was responsible for abolishing the primordial forest. According to him, the settlers did not care much for the majestic trees. They did not have the eyes to see the grandeur of the land. Their only concern was to fulfill their interest and to survive. He also laments, I quote, if it were any other country, they would have had laws to keep the forests intact and preserve them for nature lovers, as they have done with the Yosemite Park in California, the Kruger National Park in South Africa, or the National Albert Park in Belgian Congo. My distant employers do not care for the landscape. All they understand are taxes and revenue. Shobdacharan is the voice of the novelist who denounces the third world style of development, where development is meant for only a few, ignoring the interest of the most others. Vibhuti-Bhushan had a striking ability to connect the micro to the macro in a flash. He could easily situate an evening in rural Bengal into the framework of the evolution of man over the ages throughout the world. It immediately reassures the reader that everything has not lost, as it is a continuous flow. If there are genuine wills and emotions, many things can still be revived and restored. চারিধারেই উঁচু উঁচু শৈলচূড়া, তাদের মাথায় শরতের নীল আকাশ। কতকাল হইতে এই বন পাহাড় সব এই একরকমই আছে। সেই কতকাল আগে যেদিন চন্দ্রগুপ্ত প্রথম সিংহাসনে আরোহণ করেন, গ্রিকরাজ হেলিওডোরাস গরুড়ধ্বজ স্তম্ভ নির্মাণ করেন, রাজকন্যা সংযুক্তা যেদিন স্বয়ম্বর সভায় পৃথ্বীরাজের মূর্তির গলায় মাল্যদান করেন, শামুগড়ের যুদ্ধে হারিয়া হতভাগ্য দ্বারা যে রাত্রে আগ্রা হইতে গোপনে দিল্লি পলাইলেন, চৈতন্যদেব যেদিন শ্রীনিবাসের ঘরে সংকীর্তন করেন, যে দিনটিতে পলাশের যুদ্ধ হইল, মহালেখারূপের ওই শৈলচূড়া, এই বনানী ঠিক এমনই ছিল। তখন কাহারা বাস করিত এইসব জঙ্গলে? জঙ্গলের অনতি দূরে একটা গ্রামে দেখিয়া আসিয়াছিলাম, মহুয়া বীজ ভাঙিয়া তৈল বাহির করিবার জন্য দুদণ্ড কাঠের তৈরি একটা ঢিঁকির মতো কি আছে। যীশুখ্রিস্ট যেদিন ক্রুশে বিদ্ধ হইয়াছিলেন, সেদিনও উহারা মহুয়া বীজ ভাঙিয়া যেরূপ তৈল বাহির করিত, আজ সকালেও সেই রূপ করিয়াছে। This magical power of Vibhuti-Bhushan points simultaneously to the grief of loss and at the same time a sudden realization that everything is placed within a continuous flow, a stream of consciousness, and that sparkle of rich, illustrious past reflects at least a tender light on the faces of those who are small, unrecognized, defeated people today. I have come to the concluding part of my presentation. Aranyok tells about a place, a group of people, a natural diversity which should not have been lost. And in that process, it creates a sense of loss among its readers, all of whom long to visit to Shobdacharan's estate, to talk to Bhanumati, to listen to Raju Pare's songs, to rush towards the horizon on horseback on a moonlit night. In this way, the novel has a potential danger inherent in it also. It gives options. It opens up the mind of a serious reader to at least two possibilities: to protect or to destroy. I personally believe that to bring forth changes doesn't mean to destroy whatever was there in the past. Only a truly modern, wise, and liberal mind or attitude can lead to a happy blending or coexistence with the past and the present, be it in the form of ecology or technology or societal and daily habits and so on. Aranyok teaches us not to be rigid, but to be liberal. I conclude with a quote from Arnold. রাত্রি গভীর, একা প্রান্তর বাহিয়া আসিতেছে, জ্যোৎস্না অস্ত গিয়াছে, কোনো দিকে আলো দেখা যায় না, এক অদ্ভুত নিস্তব্ধতা। এ যেন পৃথিবী হইতে জনহীন কোনো অজানা গ্রহলোকে নির্বাসিত হইয়াছে। দিগন্ত রেখায় জল জলে বৃশ্চিক রাশি উদিত হইতেছে, মাথার উপরে অন্ধকার আকাশে অগণিত দুটি লোক, নিম্নে লব তুলিয়া বৈহারের নিস্তব্ধ অরণ্য, ক্ষীর নক্ষত্রালোকে পাতলা অন্ধকারে বন ঝাড়ের শীর্ষ দেখা যাইতেছে। কি অদ্ভুত রোমান্স এই মুক্ত জীবনে, প্রকৃতির সহিত ঘনিষ্ঠ নিবিড় পরিচয়ের সে কি আনন্দ। এভারেস্ট শিখরে উঠিয়া যাহারা তুষার প্রবাহে ও ঝঞ্ঝায় প্রাণ দিয়াছিল, তাহারা বিশ্ব দেবতার এই বিরাট রূপকে প্রত্যক্ষ করিয়াছে। কিংবা কলম্বাস যখন আজরাস দ্বীপের উপকূলে দিনের পর দিন সমুদ্রবাহিত কাষ্ঠখণ্ডে মহাসমুদ্র পারে অজানা মহাদেশের বার্তা জানিতে চাহিয়াছিলেন, তখন বিশ্বের এই লীলাশক্তি তার কাছে ধরা দিয়েছিল। ঘরে বসিয়া তামাক টানিয়া প্রতিবেশীর কন্যার বিবাহ ধোপানাপিত বন্ধ করিয়া যারা আসিতেছে, তাহাদের কর্ম নয় ইহার স্বরূপ কর্ম।
Thank you, Dr. Subhai Chattopadhyay. His meaningful speech on description of jungle life by Vibhushan literary work and portrait. He also described the portrait work of Nandalal Basu. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Now, I request our second speaker, Professor Rajsekhar Basu, Department of History, Calcutta University, Calcutta. Earlier, he was an ICSR Chair Professor on Indian History at Moklam, Romanis University, Lithuania. Professor Basu has published extensively on the socio-cultural history on Dalits of South Asia and beyond. The title of his pathbreaking work is The Nandanas Children's The Prayangers Thirst with Destiny, Tamil Nadu, 1850 to 1956. Other publications include Exploring the Dalit Experiences in Colonial and Post-Colonial India, and an edited volume, narrate from the various aspects of Adivasi history in India. Professor Rajsekhar Basu, his topic is the two Bengali Bhadralok and their understanding of nature, Radha Kamal Mukherjee and Meghnad Saha, and their less discussed ideas on rivers, flood and rains. Sir, Rajsekhar Basu, sir. স্যার শুনতে পাচ্ছেন? প্রফেসর রাজশেখর বসু
স্যার শোনা যাচ্ছে না, নট অডিবল
স্যার।
আরে বলবি তো জগুদা ওনাকে একবার ফোন করে না।
হ্যাঁ রিজয়েন করতে বলছি।
স্যার হ্যাঁ স্যার আপনার স্পিচ এখন আছে। হ্যালো হ্যাঁ স্যার আপনার টপিক এখন, দ্য টাইটেল অফ হিজ, আপনার টপিক এখন। হ্যাঁ আপনার নাম অ্যানাউন্স করে দিচ্ছি। হ্যাঁ স্যার রেডি। হ্যাঁ স্যার আনমিউট করেন স্যার। স্যার আনমিউট করেন স্যার। হ্যাঁ, ইয়েস 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 স্যার। হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ ঠিক আছে।
A very good afternoon to all of you. First of all, I would like to record a deep sense of appreciation for Malda College and particularly to Jagdeep Chauhan for organizing this webinar. And it also gives me immense pleasure that even if it is a virtual setting, we can come across students, we can come across colleagues, and we can come across friends. Till date, we are all surviving. That is the biggest news that we all have. That somehow or the other we have been able to somehow or the other we have been able to keep ourselves away from troubles in this pandemic. Now, today's theme, as Vipasha was arguing in the morning session, it is linked. It has something to do with, it has got something to do with the physical environs, and the physical environs means a lot of things, as she was alluding to, in terms of soil conservation, in terms of inundation of some of the very cultivable tracts, and also issues of health which had creeped up because of embankments and stories of construction which were to aid the process of colonization, of deeper colonization in the subcontinent. Now, I would like to begin my argument by stating that by the late 19th century, India's engineers, most of them were employed in the irrigation department or in the military department, and the majority of them happened to be Britishers. A very minuscule section would comprise of Eurasians and other communities, but all of them, they were having a hard time trying to assert they were having a very hard time, a very difficult time to assert their superiority over monsoon. It became clear that though the researchers of climate that though the researchers of climate science
এই তো এখানে হয়তো সফল রাহা দেখাচ্ছে তো।
Sir, may continue, sir.
It was becoming clear that though there had been a lot of researches on climate science in the late 19th century, but monsoon was still very, very difficult to predict. And many people believe that monsoon actually moved according to planetary rhythms, rhythms which were far beyond human control. Now, the first study in terms of monsoon meteorology came from a very brilliant mathematician, a man who was modest despite all his achievements, and in the British records of the late 19th century, he would go down as a very liberal-minded person and a very, very perfect gentleman. A person none other than Gilbert Thomas Walker, who was born in Rochdale, Lancashire in 1868, the fourth child in a family of 8, grew up in Croydon, which is in the suburbs of London, and his father was the borough's chief engineer. Now, Gilbert was always a very meritorious student in school. He won a scholarship for the elite St. Paul's School in 1881 and went on to join Trinity College, Cambridge, for a degree, for a career in mathematics. Now, in the 19th century, in the 19th century, he became distinguished for his study of aerodynamics, which inspired him to study the physics of atmosphere. Now, but after graduating from Cambridge, he could not really embark on a career as such, as he was stricken with an illness, and that kept him out of England for 3 years. He had to be in Switzerland for recovery, and then Walker returned back to Trinity after recuperating in Switzerland, and he joined Trinity as a fellow in mathematics, and this time he started working on electromagnetism. And to his utter surprise, in a few years' time, he was, by the turn of the century, by the turn of the 19th century, there was news pouring in that he would be posted in India as the director of the Indian Meteorological Department. Now, who could study the temperature ranges and who could study the flow of, have a first-hand knowledge in Weather Bureau. He is particularly fascinated by the techniques of the US Weather Bureau when it comes to actually deciphering the facts and figures related to climate. Now, Walker arrives in 1904, 3 years after the last major famine in India. He was based in Shimla, though he visited different parts of British India to recruit staff and strengthen the foundations of the meteorological department. Now, his understanding of monsoon was not a single ocean, it was pan-oceanic in terms of character. Walker argued that there was little evidence to show that human activity and particularly deforestation had modified India's climate in the 19th century. However, much of the denudation of the forest may have affected the climate and the soil moisture of a particular locality. The scale of monsoon far outstripped much such local influences. So as his thought turned to monsoon prediction, Walker looked to the west of India. Now, like most of the people of his times, he was very much interested in what was happening in Egypt. He was very much interested in what was happening in Egypt. The Nile had long been in the minds of Indian hydraulic engineers because it was a matter which could actually help them to compare the Indian situation with the situation in North Africa. It was a place of inspiration for them. It was also igniting competition amongst them. Now, Walker tried to understand the Nile flood, and while trying to understand the Nile flood, he came to the conclusion that the Nile flood was conditioned by the monsoon rainfall that took place in Abyssinia. And as the moist winds which provide rainfall travel in the earlier portion of their movement side by side with those ultimately reaching up to the Arabian Sea. So one section of the trade winds, the moisture-laden winds, might flow in towards Egypt, and that too after flying across humid zones of Abyssinia. Then moving north towards Egypt, and there would be a lot of rainfall over the Nile, leading to monsoon-like situation in the Nile. And one half of the trade winds actually then turn towards the right, move over the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, and actually come towards the Arabian Sea. And there would be a lot of rainfall on the western parts. So you can see that how much of this entire idea of weather prediction was now becoming a pan-oceanic issue, a very, very complicated issue. Now, one of the achievements, one of the reasons behind the achievements of Walker was his tremendous ability to synchronize statistical evidence. His tremendous statistical powers enabled him to understand the scale of wind flow both backwards and forwards between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and also the sort of movement of winds between the Azores and the Iceland, and between the areas of high and low pressure in the North Pacific. Now, in Walker's understanding, or when we try to comprehend what Walker was trying to say, Walker was actually laying a great deal of emphasis on the high and low pressure belts that actually were scattered all over the Pacific, and also the flow of trade winds from the Pacific. And this is one particular issue which actually affects the temperature range and the weather patterns in India. Now, during the First World Wars, he stayed in India for 20 years. And during the First World Wars, that is between 1914 and 1918, much work could also have progressed in terms of research on Indian weather conditions had it not been such a situation where his very, very able, trusted deputies like G.C. Simpson or Charles Norman would be taken out of India and posted in Mesopotamia, where the British were waging a war. Now, in these years, Walker was not only trying to understand what was happening in Europe, primarily because of the works of people like Wilhelm Berkanis in Bergen, his son Jacob and Halvor Solberg, but also he was trying to putting in a great deal of reliance on one of his Indian subordinates whom he respected very much, a person by the name of Hemraj. So whatever Indian climate research we know till today is not only Walker's achievement, it is also the achievement of an Indian who actually sat with Walker and tried to explain the weather scenario. And he was none other than Hemraj. And Hemraj could be credited on another point, because he hid a serious illness from his boss, Walker. And for 3 years, he suffered from that illness. But he stood by Walker because he felt that if he took leave from his service, it would mean a disaster, because Walker would not get anyone who could be helpful in this entire exercise of understanding Indian weather. Now, in 1924, Walker leaves India and joins as professor of meteorology at the Imperial College London, and where Walker actually does this entire experiment. He is involved in a plethora of experiments leading with world weather. And we find that Walker's ideas continue to flow to India. Though Walker amasses a whole lot of India, he sometimes makes some predictions, but it is not really forecast in that sense of the term. If you can say that what is the failure of Walker, the failure of Walker is his inability to make a forecast. But in the last years of the 19th century, there were also some British officers who had become interested in floods and irrigation. And one of them undoubtedly was a person whom all of you know, Sir William Wilcox, who was a product of the Rajah's irrigation department, a person who had graduated in engineering from the Thomason College, later the Roorkee College. He had been born in India in 1852 and had been one of the most important figures of British civil engineering in India. A person who had also who could also be credited for designing the first phase of the Aswan Dam in Egypt. He had worked in a whole lot of countries in Africa, for example, in Sudan and in South Africa. And he had also served as advisors for the governments of the Ottoman Empire and the United States. Now, Wilcox is particularly remembered for his readership lectures, which he read at the University of Calcutta, and which was later published as Lectures on the Ancient System of Irrigation in Bengal. In a nutshell, as Bipasha was arguing, uh, Wilcox also felt that pre-colonial village system had been lot more beneficial than the changes that had taken place because of colonial engineering in the in the British period. I mean, the from the 19th century onwards. As a as a matter of fact, the once prosperous, the very prosperous regions of the world were now being turned into regions of paucity, into regions of nutrient. They were not only they were at one length of time nutrient rich, but they were now being turned into zones of impoverishment and zones of malnourishment and so on and so forth. And one of the main blames that Wilcox had for this sort of situation is the way the British had gone around constructing railway embankments, weirs, and dams across different parts of India. And this had actually stood in the way of the free movement of water in the countryside, and rather it was the stagnant water which was the heaven for the breeding of the malaria causing mosquitoes. Now, Wilcox's ideas is very critical of the British colonial of the British engineering model that had come to India from the UK, and his ideas were not very much liked by people like C. William Adams, who is also a distinguished name. And William Adams had been the chief engineer of the irrigation department of the government of India. And C. William Adams felt that whatever Wilcox had argued in terms of siltation of soil, in terms of flood water, in terms of inundations of a vast region, thereby the topsoil, the loss of the topsoil, and also the increasing incidence of malaria. This had nothing to do with embankments, because building embankments across riverbeds had been a standard practice in engineering, and it had also been acknowledged in the West. Now, if there are such ideas, there are also ideas which are coming in from the enlightened sections of the Indian society. I had previously written a piece on Vishveshwaraya, but I'm not talking about a South Indian. I'm not talking about South Indian gentlefolk. I'm actually more interested about how the Bhadraloks, the Bengali Bhadraloks, have to talk about monsoon, have to talk about decline of soil productivity, have to talk about the moribundness of the western districts of Bengal, which seem to, and all of this seem to echo much of the intellectual concerns that actually come out of the text of a Japanese philosopher, Watsuji Tetsuro. Now, Watsuji Tetsuro, he was a scholar in Japanese aesthetics. He had translated works of Kierkegaard into Japanese. He had been a Japanese scholar who had traveled to Germany in 1927 to study under Martin Heidegger. His journey took him throughout Southeast Asia, India, and the Middle East. Now, in Vetsuji's analysis, India represented the most extreme manifestation of a monsoon climate. You cannot understand India, you cannot do anything about India unless you understood the monsoon. I quote, "It is the rainy season brought by the monsoon that has done most to create the resignation of the Indian." And he observed that over 2/3 of India's 320 millions are farmers and grow their crops thanks to the monsoon. So whether it is late and whether it lasts its due time are matters of great moment for Indian masses. But Watsujo was very much appalled by the Indians, by the average Indians' lack of reliance on technology. He said that India was technologically deficient, and the way the problems could be solved, the only way the problems could be solved, is by adoption of proper technology that would take care of the water flows that proved to be disturbing at many in many seasons. Now, Watsuji was not alone to talk about water, to talk about monsoon, and so on and so forth. Between the wars, many Asian students, scientists, and political leaders had contemplated the relationship between nature and power, because there was this sort of understanding that the West was actually was progressing at a very rapid pace, because the West actually was trying to extend the humanly was trying to extend humanly capabilities over nature. So once you could dominate the nature, it also gives you political and economic priority. So there was this entire there were studies going on between to explore the relationships between nature and power, between nature and empire, between nature and nation, and so on and so forth. Now, all these somehow or the other happened to filter into the minds of the Bengali Bhadralok class. And I begin by taking up the views, the observation of a Bengali sociologist and also an economist, Radha Kamal Mukherjee, who had been a distinguished professor at Lucknow University, and who had devoted much time and many pages in the 1920s and 30s to understand the problems of rural India. Now, Mukherjee was somehow or the other lost to the Bengali reading public in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, or 70s, or even 80s. And it is only in the last years of the 20th century that Mukherjee's writings resurfaced, and that too because of an effort of a historian published a volume of Mukherjee's writings, and also his great work on the Moribund Delta, by writing an introduction and putting all these writings into a single volume. Now, Mukherjee certainly, not only to Bandyopadhyay but to many other social theorists in present times, they see him as an ecologically sensitive academic and who favored a localist approach to development. He stands out, but he stands out for his ambiguity. No person, whenever you actually come across the writings of any great person, they are not very consistent. You can't say that they remain uniform throughout. There are elements of ambiguity in the writings of great personalities, and Mukherjee also had his share of ambiguities. He was a committed eugenicist. He absorbed the racial and environmental determinism, logic, standards of his time, and then inverted it, calling, for instance, for Lebensstrom, for teeming millions of India and China. Lebensstrom means progress or advancement. Nevertheless, his was a rare voice about India's environmental balance at a time of rapid development, and his concerns were mortality. Mukherjee, man cannot be regarded as separate and independent. He observed that crimes against nature would in turn lead to destructive forces. He argued that wise developmental patterns would be of man with the organic and the inorganic world around him. Only if there is a balance between man and this world of nature, that there could be security, well-being, and progress. Now, Mukherjee's description for India's future came from. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, yes.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Now, Mukherjee was talking about the natural balance of humans with the nature, and this balance to him actually could ensure security, well-being, and progress. Now, Mukherjee's prescription for India's future comes from his very close study of the riverine landscape of his native land, Bengal, drawing on the work of a Russian anarchist geographer, Leon Mechnikov, who in 1889 published a wide-ranging history of riverine civilizations, including that of the Ganges Valley. Mukherjee felt that it was an ideal time to understand river basins as living entities. Each river was a synthesis or epitome of all the possible environmental variations and influences. Each rivers have very distinct properties. Each rivers have for for any historian who is interested in histories of environment. Now, he believed that hydraulic dynamics of the delta were the products of the inextricable mixture of ecological and human factors in the colonial period. It is true that on one line, Mukherjee's thinking suggests specific mistakes and a possible path to revival, but his definition is also not something which is uniform or one which actually goes about on the basis of a single logic or a single determinant. Indeed, he does not try to address the two threads of arguments or seek to assign the relative degree of responsibilities on any factor for the decline of parts of Bengal. In fact, the crisis in the western districts of Bengal could be related to the shifting courses of rivers on one hand and the short-sightedness of the colonial water and land management policies on the other, which are not contradictory by all purposes. Arun Bandyopadhyay had argued that the land building processes which had originally nourished Bengal's agriculture had long been partly anthropogenic, and the specific problem of decadence had come with the increase of human-induced sedimentation. But the increase sometimes makes the qualitative difference in history. Now, Meghnad Shah, a physicist and internationally known for his research in physics, expressed ideas about floods and irrigation works in the early part of the 1950s, much later, about 2 or 3 decades after Radha Kamal Mukherjee had started writing on these issues. Now, Shah was a very firm believer in the philosophy that science offered a panacea in regard to all problems created by floods and famines. He believed that the adoption of proper scientific measures were a real answer to these problems. So in September 1955, while he was speaking at the Lok Sabha on a motion regarding flood control projects in the second, it had been recognized since 1947 that the valley of the Mahanadi River forms a unitary whole, and that the Mahanadi floods could be controlled if effective measures were taken. Shah stated that the preliminary foundations to erect dams on the Mahanadi were devised during British rule, and after independence, the government of India was involved in the laying of foundation stones for dams, and these events were celebrated with much pomp and grandeur. But there was utter confusion in the government ranks about the sort of strategies that were to be followed regarding the implementation of the Mahanadi project. He blamed the minister for giving in to much fanfare and in believing in what his officials had to convey. The officials, according to Shah, had the habit of exaggerating developments. In one of his articles on floods and science and culture, Shah had strongly argued that the Hirakud project was hastily conceived and that the government should have given more attention to the alternatives. He felt that while the setting up of a dam in Hirakud might have acted as a sort of a magic, it might have been seen as a magic, but the more ideal site would have been a place a bit lower stream than the Hirakud, situated at a bit lower stream than the Hirakud, a place called Tikkarpara. Shah felt that it would be impossible to control flood situations if there was no attempt to control the tributaries which all emptied their water in the Mahanadi. The Mahanadi River, he stated, was made up of a large number of tributaries. As a scientist, Shah came up with claims to have piloted studies which tried to comprehend meteorological and hydrological conditions in the Mahanadi basin, and he reached the conclusion that monsoon rains had a tendency of being precipitated over wide regions simultaneously. He believed that river could not be completely controlled until some of the main branches at best were also controlled, and this required effective measures for putting dams at the tributaries on the tributaries. The opinion of the foreign experts carried little value to Shah because he felt that they were not acquainted with the physical conditions of India. They had no idea of monsoons and also had no knowledge of precipitation in the different that happened in the different river valleys. These points required intensive study by Indians, and there was really no need for deploying foreign experts. Shah also gave suggestions for the prevention of flood conditions in Bihar and in the Himalayan rivers. He pointed out that the river Ganges and its tributaries carry an amount of flood water which is about 100 times the volume of water that is carried by 1,000 times the volume of water that is carried on by the Damodar River. Though the work on the Damodar River was not being carried out on a scale that would have been to his satisfaction. But going back to Bihar, Saha observed that it was difficult to keep control of the flood as the sources of the rivers happened to be in places beyond the frontiers of India. He stated, I quote, "How can you control the Gandak when the precipitation takes place in Nepal?" The Swedish explorer Seven Hedin had once observed, and this Shah is writing, that the floods of the Brahmaputra could be controlled if some of the water could be diverted down to the Gandak River. So you cannot do anything for the control of the Himalayan rivers unless there is some agreement with countries like Nepal and Bhutan about the control of these rivers in the upper reaches. That appears to be essential. Shah goes on, I do not think that there is a river laboratory for northern Bihar, though we are talking about the control of Bihar rivers. The Kosi river of which we are talking so much, the Saptakoshi, the Sankoshi and the Arun, all come and join in a fork in Nepal. How can you control the Kosi river unless you have got more details of the discharges of these rivers, which cannot be done without the cooperation of the Nepal government? Saha insisted that flood control was possible if river gauges were installed in different parts of India and Nepal. He felt that something had to be done in Bhutan for the floods in Assam and partly to the rivers that are coming in from Bhutan. In Jaldhaka and other places, the floods are due to the rainwater coming down from the valleys of these rivers over which the Indian government had no control. Now, Saha's ideas about floods, actually much before the Lok Sabha speech and much before the sort of speeches that Shah has for the audience in the Asian conference that is held in Delhi in 1955, Shah had published a very, very important essay much earlier in 1943. The essay was titled Flood, Envisaging Wholesale Environmental Transformation. He described the decline of the Damodar River as one which had been occasioned by the construction of railway embankments. and these constructions had actually diverted the flow of water. Its course had moved towards Calcutta, and thus the city was being threatened by floods. He wanted the Damodar River to be made a perennial river rather than a seasonal river. That is, to liberate it from the monsoon. He argued for the conservation would strip the Damodar of its destructive powers. He argued that the claim that deforestation affected rainfall was absurd. There was not single iota of truth in it. Shah pointed out that rainfall in the Damodar Valley was determined by the atmospheric conditions in the Bay of Bengal, which are generally thousands of feet in depth. Local conditions could have little effect upon them. Shah spoke in praise of the dam building experiments in the United States from 1915 onwards, and that of the global circulation of ideas and technology that would come to India's aid. He envisaged that construction of dams in eastern India would last for 100 years. So he was a modernist. Now, if we take the Bhadralok perceptions of floods, would definitely bring out the commonalities and differences in the opinions of intellectuals based in different parts of Asia. It is just not that the Bengali Bhadraloks intellectually differ amongst each other. But these are also differences that are seen within the Asian intellectuals on a much broader scale. There was undoubtedly a rise in awareness about cyclones and how they affected the coastal arcs of Asia. There were many who were attracted to geography and climatology. And this brought in the idea of monsoon Asia because it guided the rhythm of the rural experience, not only in different parts of Asia, but also in the subcontinent. The discussion on rivers, waters, and seas proved to be something which transcended the concepts of nation and empire. But the conflicts among powers in Asia, abated by European nations, did vindicate that despite commonalities in approaches, borders were often dividing the people. And this was evident in post 1940s Asia. Now, Mukherjee and in the case of Mukherjee and Shah, it was also a matter which was linked to their ideological differences. Mukherjee was one of the earliest of the environmentalists in India and shared a romanticism for the rural republics of Bengal, which he felt had to be kept isolated from the predatory instincts of the state, whether it be the colonial state or whether in future the independent nation state representing the Indians. It is apparent that Mukherjee would be less interested in centralized planning, which would find favor from Shah, who was deeply influenced by scientists, Western ideas of rationality, and that of a culture of materiality. His frequent reference to the advancement of the West and the necessity of adopting them vindicates beyond all doubt that technology would be the answer to the environmental perils which upset the rural life of Bengal. While there was an element of romanticism in Mukherjee, that of keeping the western districts of Bengal away from the global networks of trade and commerce, in the long run, this would be the preferred model, which would find sustenance from the writings of Vandana Shiva and many others. On the other hand, Shah's model, despite his very publicized people-centric approach, would run into controversy, would run into thick debates, particularly from the late 1970s, when the Big Dam experiment would itself be banned by the West, where critics would point to the side effects, to the evil effects of salinity, deforestation, health maladies, and untimely flooding of the agricultural regions. These issues had been overlooked by Shah, who, like Vishweshwaraya, had believed that harnessing of rivers could be the possible solution for all-round rural decline. But it was seldom realized that technology and the damming of rivers would lead to new problems characterized by the ever-increasing rich-poor divide in the rural localities. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now the session is questionnaire session. Students and others person can can ask the immediate personalities to inquiry your.
Can I say something? Jagdeep, can I say something?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Because I'm chairing the session, I would like to say a few words before you throw it open to the others. Okay. Now, first
Yes.
of all, I would like to thank, both the speakers of this session, Sudhayu Chattopadhyay and Raj Shekhar. Both of you. Now, it was a very interesting essay that you read today. Your talk on the Aranya. You have reiterated the fact how literature is so vital to the understanding of life. You know how it's a very you could if you could mute your microphone. Okay. It is so important for understanding society of at a particular time. It is a very illuminating paper that you read out for you, and as you very clearly said that for an understanding of the flora, the fauna, social life of the people, for a glimpse into the rural life of a locality, literary texts can so very well be used. And where the short archive don't go, that archival sources don't allow us that entry. I'm very happy. You have muted me. Okay. Raj Shekhar, brilliant as usual. You have very well. I was very happy to hear you today. You have tried to contextualize the work of Radha Kamal Mukherjee and Meghnad Saha in the broader perspective, what was going on in the colonial context. Radha Kamal Mukherjee, as you very rightly said, he has not really been studied. I remember about 15 years ago, I myself did one article on Radha Kamal Mukherjee's work on his thoughts on rural reconstruction, published about 15 years ago. The information that he gives us on the, that is tremendous. So is Meghnad Shah. Make a study. He wrote a 500-page report on the existing agrarian condition in India, in different parts of India, and how improvements could be undertaken. So, keeping this changes in mind that were taking place, the way you try to contextualize, try to place the Bengali into the very good. I mean, I really like it. Okay, now I'm sure there will be many questions on this, so you can ask questions. Maybe should we go speaker by speaker, or should we take the questions together? Anyway, let us have the questions now. Jagdeep.
Thank you, Bipasha. Thank you, Bipasha. Jagdeep.
Yes.
Jagdeep.
বলেন।
আমি এই কম্পিউটারটা চেঞ্জ করে অন্য কম্পিউটারে যাচ্ছি, আমার ছেলের আসলে ক্লাস আছে। হ্যাঁ, আমি একটু পরে আমি কোশ্চেনগুলো নিচ্ছি আবার, ঠিক আছে?
ঠিক আছে, হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ, তাহলে
let us have the questions from Shubhayu first, then Shubhayu.
হ্যাঁ,
Jagdeep,
হ্যাঁ বলছি।
questions কার কি questions আছে?
আগে কার কি কোশ্চেন আছে? হ্যাঁ, একটু সুভায়ু স্যারকে প্রশ্ন করতে পারো। হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ,
আগে সুভায়ু। আমারটা মিউট করে দিলাম। let us have the
আচ্ছা, ঠিক আছে। আচ্ছা আচ্ছা, হ্যাঁ। ছাত্রছাত্রী বা আদার্স পার্সনের কোনো প্রশ্ন থাকলে অবশ্যই সুভায়ু স্যারকে প্রশ্ন করতে পারো। প্রশ্ন বা জিজ্ঞাসা বা কোনো একটা বিষয়।
বাংলা কোনো অসুবিধা নেই, ইংরেজি বাংলা যাই।
জগদীপ,
হ্যাঁ বলেন।
বলছি আমি এখানে চ্যাট বক্স দেখছি বিক্রম মুখার্জি বলে একজন প্রশ্ন
হ্যাঁ
করেছে।
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ, মেথোলজির উপর প্রশ্ন করেছে।
বিক্রম মুখার্জি কি আছে, একবার দেখবে?
বিক্রম বিক্রম মন্ডল না মুখার্জি, বিক্রম মুখার্জি কে আছেন?
বিক্রম মুখার্জি।
বিক্রম মুখার্জি কে আছেন?
মানে প্রশ্ন আমি
1 minute. শুভায়ু, বিক্রম মুখার্জির কোয়েশ্চেনটা তুমি নাও ওখানে পড়তে পারছো, ইউ আনসার দ্য কোয়েশ্চেন। আমি পড়ে
আচ্ছা,
দিচ্ছি
আমি 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 দেখতে পাচ্ছি, আমি বলছি।
হ্যাঁ ঠিক আছে, তুমি কোয়েশ্চেনটার উত্তর দাও, আনসার।
আমার যেটা মনে হয় বিক্রম মুখার্জি প্রশ্ন নিয়ে, সেটা হচ্ছে যে ও বক্তব্য হচ্ছে যে লিটারেচারকে কিভাবে আমরা মেথোডোলজির মধ্যে আনতে পারি, এবং সেটা কিভাবে অন্যান্য প্রাইমারি সোর্সের সঙ্গে মেলাতে পারি। তাতে আমার যেটা বলার সেটা হচ্ছে যে আমি বলেছিলাম আমার লেকচারে কি যে লিটারেচার ইজ ক্যান বি হেল্পফুল টু আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ড দ্য স্পিরিট অফ অ্যান এজ, টু আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ড আ মিলিউ। It cannot be relied as a source, literature in its modern form. আগেকার দিনে হলে লিটারেচারের মধ্যে সব রকম জিনিস আসতো, প্যামফ্লেট আসতো, জার্নাল আসতো, সবকিছু বলা হতো। বাট টুডে ইফ ইউ কনসিডার লিটারেচার only from aesthetic side, then
যে যদি আমাকে কলোনিয়াল পিরিয়ড স্টাডি করতে হয় বা কিছু, তাহলে কিন্তু আমি এই লিটারেচারটাকে বাদ দিতে পারবো না। তার কারণ হচ্ছে লিটারেচার, আমি এটা খুব সহজ ভাষায় বলছি, সেটা হচ্ছে যে ধরো আর্কাইভ বা ডকুমেন্ট দেখে আমি জানতে পারবো যে একটা অন্য কন্টেক্সট ধরি, যে কোনো জিনিসপত্রের দাম কত হচ্ছে একটা পার্টিকুলার সময়, কিভাবে ওঠানামা করছে, অল দ্যাট করা social to have a social history of particular time. Okay?
বিপাশাদি একটা কথা বলি।
হ্যাঁ বলো নিশ্চয়ই।
বিপাশাদি, আমি আর আপনি বোধহয় একই কথা বলছি, যে যখন আমরা ইতিহাসে কিছু লিখতে বসছি তখন তো আমার তো ফ্যাক্টস তো রাখতেই হচ্ছে। লিটারেচারটা আমাকে সেই সময়টাকে বুঝতে সাহায্য করছে।
নিশ্চয়ই, এক্স্যাক্টলি।
সেটা ফাদার অ্যান্ড সান রিলেশন হোক, লোকজনের মধ্যে রিলেশন হোক, দামের কথা হোক, আমি আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ড দ্য মিলিউ, আই আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ড দ্য এজ। তাই তো লিটারেচার সেই সাহায্যটা করছে আমাকে।
হ্যাঁ, লিটারেচার ছাড়া কিন্তু কোনো এজকে বোঝা যায় না।
আমি সেটাই বলছি।
Without literature you can really not understand a particular age. Okay? আচ্ছা শুভায়ু, আরেকটা কথা বলি, এখানে ঐশী গুপ্ত বলে একজন একটা কমেন্ট করেছে, would you like to comment on that comment?
আমি পড়লাম, no, I don't have anything to add to it. ঠিক আছে।
ওকে, আরেকটা দেখো, আরেকটা কি কোয়েশ্চেন আছে নাকি একটাই কোয়েশ্চেন ছিল? শাশ্বত ভট্টাচার্য, তুমি ওটা বলো, কি বলবে? অনেকেই তো পড়তে পারছো, তুমি জাস্ট বলো, তোমার গিভ ইউ আ কমেন্ট টু দ্যাট।
শাশ্বত ভট্টাচার্যের প্রশ্নটা আসলে ওর নিজের প্রশ্নের ভেতরেই সমস্ত উত্তর রয়েছে। কারণ আমি আরণ্যকে যেটা বলেছি সেখানে বারবার এই কথাই বলেছি কি যে এই মানুষের দুরবস্থা, আমি অসভ্য বা বর্বর কথাগুলো ইউজ করছি না, আমি বলছি মানুষের দুরবস্থার পেছনে নিশ্চিতভাবে শোষণ প্রক্রিয়া কাজ করছে। আর কিন্তু এই ক্ষোভ যন্ত্রণা কতখানি নীল বিদ্রোহ, কোল বিদ্রোহ, হুল বিদ্রোহের পশ্চাতে দায়ী ছিল, সেটা তো একটা অন্য পলিটিক্সের মধ্যে ঢুকে গেল। সেটা সবসময় যে সবটা এদের ক্ষোভ যন্ত্রণাকে আমরা আনতে পেরেছি তা বোধ হয় নয়। আপাতত এইটুকুই বলছি।
থ্যাংক ইউ শুভায়ু। আর কারো কোনো প্রশ্ন আছে কি শুভায়ু চট্টোপাধ্যায়? কারো কোনো প্রশ্ন আছে? Anything that you would like to answer? I mean, like to okay. হয়তো আর নেই, এনিওয়ে, বাট পরে যদি থাকে ইউ ক্যান অলওয়েজ ইমেল টু শুভায়ুদা।
থ্যাংক ইউ।
নেক্সট আমি বলি, ক্যান উই হ্যাভ রাজশেখর কি এসেছে? আর ইউ দেয়ার রাজশেখর? মুভ অন টু দ্য আদার স্পিকার।
রাজশেখর বাবুকে দেখা যাচ্ছে না এখনো।
রাজশেখর,
রাজশেখর স্যারকে এখনো দেখা যাচ্ছে না, দেখি ফোন করে নি একটু।
হ্যাঁ তুমি ফোন করো রাজশেখর। পেলে?
না পাচ্ছি না আমি, সুইচ অফ আছে মোবাইলটা, মানে ব্যাটারি চার্জ শেষ হয়ে গেছে নাকি স্যারের।
তো আমরা কি করব?
ও
চেয়ারপারসন
বলছি
করুন।
আচ্ছা, যদি কোনো প্রশ্ন থাকে তাহলে আরো সুবাবু স্যারকে প্রশ্ন করতে পারো, আর না হলে আমরা পরে চলে যাচ্ছি পরের সেশনে, যে সেশন ভোট অফ থ্যাঙ্কস এর সেশনে আমি চলে যাব আমরা।
ঠিক আছে, দেন shall I close the session? Close the session. আচ্ছা, এই একটা কথা শুধু বলে দিই, এই সেশনটা ক্লোজ করার আগে দেখছি 7টা ভোটার যদি একটা কয়েকটা প্রশ্ন হয় না, বাট স্টিল আই উইল জাস্ট সে যে কমেন্ট যেটা করেছে, এখানে একটা কমেন্ট হচ্ছে কনসেপ্ট অফ রুরাল রিকনস্ট্রাকশন, হাউ মাচ কনসেপ্ট অফ রুরাল রিকনস্ট্রাকশন কন্ট্রিবিউটেড টু দ্য কনসেপ্ট অফ self-dependence or আত্মশক্তি like rural banks and promotion of Swadeshi. I would say that এই কোয়েশ্চেনটা একটু উল্টো করে করা হয়েছে, অর্থাৎ আত্মশক্তি বা সেলফ ডিপেন্ডেন্স এই কনসেপ্টটা যেটা রবীন্দ্রনাথ প্রথম থেকে বলে আসছেন, সেই কনসেপ্টটাকে কার্যকরী করার একটা উপায় হচ্ছে রুরাল রিকনস্ট্রাকশনের মাধ্যমে। অর্থাৎ যখন রুরাল রিকনস্ট্রাকশন করছে তখন সেলফ ডিপেন্ডেন্স এবং আত্মশক্তি এই কনসেপ্টটাকে বের করছেন। অর্থাৎ একটা ছোট কথায় বলে দিই, that no help from outside will enable the process of development. আর গান্ধী আর এই এসছেন, আমার মনে হয় এটা মানে I can answer, but I would not like to answer this now at the moment. কিভাবে how it affected the ideas of Gandhi and all that, because the main idea was how nature fitted into his theme of rural reconstruction. That was what I was talking about. Question হয়ে গেছে on the বৃহত্তর aspect of rural reconstruction, ওটা বলতে গেলে অনেক, তো সেটার মধ্যে you can read my book which deals at length on all this. Okay, now Jagdeep পেয়েছো রাজশেখর দাকে?
না না না, পেলাম না।
তাহলে I think I shall close this session. এবার তুমি তোমার নেক্সট সেশনে চলে যাও, আর যদি রাজশেখরকে কোনো প্রশ্ন থাকে তাহলে they can mail it, আর পরে তারা ইন্ডিভিজুয়ালি উত্তর পেতেই পারে।
ঠিক আছে ম্যাডাম। Now I request to
thanks to the speakers once again for two very brilliant presentations, Shubhai Chattopadhyay and Raj Shekhar, both of them. I'm very happy to have chaired this session. One my student and the other a very old friend.
Thank you Bipashadi, thank you.
Thank you ম্যাডাম, থ্যাংক ইউ সুবায়ুদা আমাদের এই প্রোগ্রামে জয়েন করার জন্য, থ্যাংক ইউ। স্যারকে পাচ্ছি না, স্যার হয়তো, আচ্ছা যাই হোক। আচ্ছা, নাও আই রিকোয়েস্ট টু
থ্যাঙ্কসটা আমি দিব।
ও আপনি দিবেন, ঠিক আছে। নাও আই রিকোয়েস্ট টু মোহাম্মদ সৌরভ আলী, অ্যাসোসিয়েট প্রফেসর, মালদা কলেজ, মালদা, টু ডেলিভার এ ভোট অফ থ্যাঙ্কস।
শোনা যাচ্ছে না?
হ্যাঁ শোনা যাচ্ছে।
My heartiest thanks to our eminent scholars like Professor Bipasa Raha, Mr. Bharati, Dr. Subayu Chattopadhyay, Mr. Bharati, Professor Rajkumar Shekhar Basu, Calcutta University. I also thanks to our principal, Dr. Manoj Kumar Boddo, who is chairman of this webinar. I also like to thank Professor Subhas Choudhury, convener IQAC, Professor Chandan Rai, Department of Political Science. Thanks to the convener, Professor Jagdeep Chauhan, convener of our webinar. Thanks to all esteemed colleagues of our department. Thanks to our beloved students, both UG and PG, who are important part of this webinar. I'd like to conclude with these words to thank to everybody once again. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now the last session is valedictory session. I request Sir Prabhat Choudhury, Associate Professor, Department of Economics and convener of IUPC Malda College, Malda, to say something about.
Thank you, Jagdeep,
Yes.
and thanks to the Department of History of our college for giving me the space to addressing the valediction. And practically, I am listening for the last few hours, and like all our students, and I am also listening and practically realizing the uh, the endeavor have taken our resource person, and practically we are looking the natural and rural world through the eyes of practically four great identities of our colonial period. Um, we all know about Bhumibhushan and Meghnad Saha, and practically I should thank Professor Raj Shekhar Basu for making me curious about Radha Gobal Mukherjee. We are we are uh, very proud to know that Binoy Sarkar was the great son of Malda, uh, and practically I have found that Radha Kamal was the great, and both were great friends, classmates, and Radha Kamal acknowledged the influence of Binoy Sarkar in life, and both were deeply involved with their surroundings. Uh, Practically, I learned much from this webinar, and for the and from um, the, the lectures of our resource person. Regarding literature, I can share my experience. Once I was connected with the Center for Urban Studies of Calcutta University, uh, and I was listening uh, I have dialogue with Amiyo Kumar Bakshi, uh, and other professors of uh, history of economic
বলছি দেখো
thoughts or
চার্টে
economic
দেখো তো
studies.
ওয়েবিনারের সার্টিফিকেটের জন্য লিংকটা দিচ্ছি, দেখা যাচ্ছে? আচ্ছা দাঁড়াও আমি ফোন করব।
So they always emphasize
দাঁড়াও আমি তোমার ব্যবস্থা করছি, দাঁড়াও।
to know about the economic life of past. They always emphasize and they told that literature should must be read, and through literature we can only provide literature. Always, as Subhayu said, in aesthetic sense. Uh, Practically, the subject, the topic is very relevant and very important for us in nowadays, and very specifically in uh, in Corona period. And we are realizing that in this modern civilization, to be specific, in this capitalist civilization, we are continuously being separated from nature, and continuous destruction of the condition of our existence. Uh, it is now life and death question for us. Because all forms of life, the precondition of this of our living, the precondition of not to die, is the continuous metabolic exchange between man and nature, and as a part of nature or within nature, whatever we can say. And we are creating this so-called civilization, market-driven, money-driven civilization, and making science purely separated from humans and humanity, only objective, natural law-driven world of science. And this is highly pathetic in this situation. And we are becoming practically limited to town animal and village animal. Town animal separating from nature, from land, and village animal cutting off from all cultural intercourse of the world. very through digital revolution, village people may have some scope now of reducing this cultural distance, but the situation of urban life is absolutely worse and deadly visible in Corona ambience. So, thanks again to our district department, to our all learned resource persons. They help us to connect to our glorious past, to our glorious persons. They are doing to recover our relations with nature through knowledge, through social understanding, through statistical survey.
ওইভাবে সার্টিফিকেটটা জেনারেট হবে। এখন থেকে 30 মিনিট খোলা থাকবে। আমি লিংক চ্যাট বক্সে দিয়ে দিয়েছি। যারা ফিল আপ করবে এবং এই ফিল আপ যারা করবে তারাই সার্টিফিকেট পাবে, কারণ এটা অটোমেটিকলি জেনারেট হবে এবং এটা ফিল আপ করার সঙ্গে সঙ্গে সার্টিফিকেটটা তোমাদের মেলে চলে যাবে। অতএব আমি বলছি যে তোমরা এটাকে খুব কেয়ারফুলি ফিল আপ করবে যাতে বানান টানান ভুল না হয়, কারণ সার্টিফিকেট ওইভাবেই তৈরি হয়ে যাবে। Now the last session of the webinar, to say something about my department, department colleagues, very junior colleagues, Sri Probal Banerjee, Assistant Professor, Malda College, Malda, to say something about webinar.
Thank you, everybody. Honorable speakers, respected principal, colleagues and participants, I, on behalf of the Department of History, Malda College, Malda, extend our heartiest thanks to the eminent speakers, Professor Rajshekhar Basu, Professor of History, University of Calcutta, Professor Bipasha Raha, Professor of History, Vishwabharati University, and Professor Shubhayu Chattopadhyay, Professor of History, Vishwabharati University, who Mohammad Shohrab Ali said, for leading this webinar towards the successful event. My sincere thanks to the convener of this webinar, Sri Jagdeep Chauhan, for organizing this event a meaningful one. Thanks to
যারা ছিলাম তারা আপনার এই প্রোগ্রাম শুনতে পেরে, মানে এই লকডাউন পিরিয়ডে আমরা একটা ক্লাসের মতোই পেয়ে গেলাম, এটা আমাদের কাছে সত্যি সৌভাগ্য। সুবায়ুদা, আপনাকে আমি যোগাযোগ করলাম, আপনি একবারে রাজি হয়ে গেলেন, এর জন্য আমার খুবই ভালো লাগছে এবং খুবই আমরা উপকৃত। আমরা এত প্রান্তিক কলেজে আছি, মালদা কলেজে, কিন্তু আপনার মতো একটা ব্যক্তিত্ব যার সুন্দর এবং সুমধুর তার বর্ণনা, এবং সেই বর্ণনা আমরা আবার শুনতে পেলাম, আবার অপেক্ষায় রইব। রাজশেখর বাবুকে আমি এই মুহূর্তে পেলাম না, আবার তিনি জয়েন করেছিলেন কিন্তু পাইনি। আমাদের সঙ্গে প্রভাস চৌধুরী স্যার থাকার জন্য আমরা খুব আনন্দিত, ইকোনমিক্স ডিপার্টমেন্টে, এবং তিনি আইপিসির কনভেনার, এবং আমাদের সঙ্গে তিনি 3 ঘন্টা ছিলেন, আমার খুব ভালো লেগেছে। আমাদের ডিপার্টমেন্টের এইচওডি সৌরভ আলী স্যার আমাদের সঙ্গে 3 ঘন্টা আছেন, আমার আদার্স কলিগ যারা আমাদের সঙ্গে আছে, এবং আমাদের সঙ্গে আছে আমাদের ছাত্র যারা এতক্ষণ ধরে আমাদেরকে সহযোগিতা করেছে, এবং আমার অন্যান্য যেমন কালিয়াচক কলেজের এখানে আমি দেখতে পাচ্ছি ঋতব্রত গোস্বামী, সে আমাদের সঙ্গে আছে। সুন্দর একটা প্রোগ্রাম আপনাদের সাপোর্টে আমরা করতে পেরেছি, এই জন্য খুব আনন্দিত। দিদি, সুবায়ুদা, তাহলে প্রোগ্রামটা আমরা শেষ করছি।
থ্যাংক ইউ জগদীপ।
থ্যাংক ইউ বাই দেন।
ঠিক আছে, নমস্কার সবাইকে, থ্যাংক ইউ।
ঠিক আছে, ঠিক আছে, লিংকটা এখনো খোলা থাকবে আধা ঘন্টা।
হ্যালো স্যার।
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ
হ্যাঁ স্যার, বলছিলাম যে ডেজিগনেশনটা ওটা কি দেবো ওটা স্যার?
স্টুডেন্ট দেবে, স্টুডেন্ট
দাও। প্রভাস বাবু, আমাদের এই লিংকটা খোলা আছে, আপনি এখন হয়ে গেছে, আপনি এখন মানে বেরিয়ে যেতে, ছাত্রদের জন্য খোলা আছে, কি প্রশ্ন করবে কিভাবে লিখবে তার জন্য এই লিংকটা খুলে রেখেছি। প্রবাল, একটু দেখো যদি কোনো ছাত্র কোনো সমস্যা হয়।